So I'll just make a very quick welcome the welcome, if you like. So I'm Dave Booth at WTS, and we're hosting this Marine Park Forum today. I'm hoping you there out in television land can hear us, and that the audio visuals and the technology work as well as they can today. And we're already a couple of minutes behind schedule. It'll be a race today. But I'd first like to welcome Professor Ian Ments from the School of Life Sciences at UTS, who's going to welcome us in our forum.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the traditional owners on the land which we meet today. For those of you here on campus with us, that's the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. Now, environmental management and marine conservation is probably not the first thing that you think of when you think of UTS, University of Technology Sydney, and our modern inner city campus. However, UTS has significant capability in this area, with world-class researchers located in the School of Life Sciences and the Climate Change Cluster, otherwise known as the C3 Institute. Some of our marine science activity takes place at the Sydney Institute of Marine Sciences, of which UTS was one of the founding university partners back in 2005. However, the nature of marine science means that research happens in the coast right around the country and even beyond. I'd like to just draw your attention, something that you might not know, is that UTS is really committed to social justice and making the world a better place for future generations. And because of this, the university and the faculty take a responsibility to be leaders in achieving the targets of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. That commitment is reflected in the recent Times Higher Education overall global impact ratings for the Sustainable Development Goals, where UTS ranked 3rd in the nation and 14th in the world for our impact towards achieving those goals. Particularly relevant to today's forum is the faculty's commitment to being a leader on SDG 13, which is climate action, and SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure and development. And you might go, how does that fit in? But really, I think to make a difference, we need all sectors and all stakeholders to come together and work collaboratively to make a difference. Although I'm not a marine scientist, I'm actually a biochemist. In prior university leadership roles, I've actually had a lot of time working with a diversity of stakeholders, including fishing industries, including government agencies and conservation groups around the management of marine resources. Now, one thing that I've learned over time is that although the different stakeholders can often be, should I say, at crossroads with one another, my experience is that two things, sustainability and evidence-based science are two themes that have the ability to unite those diverse opinions. So with that in mind, on behalf of the university and of the Faculty of Science, I wish you all the best for a constructive and thought-provoking forum, and I trust that you enjoy your time here at UTS today. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Ian, for that thought-provoking introduction, and to maybe inform many people out there that UTS does all these things. We often may seem a little hidden, but we're certainly out there doing the jobs, doing the research and the liaisons. So I hope that people out there who aren't in the room, and there's a good number in the room considering our trains, are able to hear and join in. So I just quickly wanted to move the slide There it is. So I thought I'd just, at the very beginning, put things in what I think are a bit of perspective. Right, the sun just comes, that's good. And just note that we have the most magnificent coastline in New South Wales. Having travelled most of the world and dived in and jumped in around the place, you can't beat New South Wales. Queensland's lovely, it's got the Barrier Reef, but the coast is a great big estuary because of the Great Barrier Reef. Some lovely stuff down south, but it's about 14 degrees in the water. We have this most amazing coastline, and that's worth knowing and worth appreciating. Whatever you do in the ocean, whether you're a swimmer, a fisher, a scuba diver, a silly old scientist, a kid, or whatever, it's an amazing playground. And part of the interesting part of it's driven through the East Australian Current. We all see Nemo, not that inaccurate actually. And the East Australian Current gives us our warmer conditions in Sydney and brings a bevy of tropical beauty down the coast. But it also means we have very interesting coastline. And in New South Wales, you can dive on coral reefs. You can, around Sydney and further south, you can see the magnificent sea dragon, one of our friends. And further south, around Eden, you may get away from this, you'll get into the giant kelp, the macrocystis forests and that sort of thing, as well as the muddy bottoms, the mangroves, all those sorts of things in New South Wales. Not to mention Lord Howe Island, stuck out there somewhere, which if you've never been there, you should get there, like this stuff. And of course, we do have our problems. Typical biologist, I get straight into the issues. Now, I'm a fish biologist, so, and that plus the fact that a lot of the marine parks issues around the world, really, are driven by a potential or a possible conflict between the fishing and conservation groups. Well, I'm hoping that today may go somewhere towards breaking down those barriers, because I think we're all at a certain level lovers of the ocean that want to look after for our kids and that sort of thing. So obviously we do have issues, and the interesting thing is the data that's come out shows the issues are not as great in protected areas. So they do have value not only for the fish and the other organisms there, but also outside areas if you want to fish or do other observational work. So I won't go into all the science. Some of it's going to be talked about today, as well as there'll be speakers talking about interesting fauna and flora and their love and their passion for the ocean. And then we'll also be talking about different potential hotspots, different marine park areas that need to be looked at more closely. And I can sit here for hours and hours talking to you about all the world-leading science done right in New South Wales and elsewhere nearby, showing the value of not just marine parks, but the sanctuary zones, the actual no-take areas within them. They are the goal. Time and again, I think some of the speakers will demonstrate this. The areas around have some value, but much more limited value if they are up, any exploitation is allowed, and that's clear. Now, around the world, embarrassingly, as a human and someone who wants to not be laughed at or scorned by future generations, we haven't managed to look after very much of it. There's 8 billion of us. That's really the big problem we don't like to talk about. We all want a little bit, and especially in a place like Australia, per capita, we have a much higher imprint of the world. And that leads to climate change, pollution. But we don't do much about it. We don't look after areas of the ocean as well as we should. So only about 1 or 2% of the ocean is properly protected, if that. So it's not surprising that the problem is also in Australia. Ideally, we would like, what these there? That you missing half the action up there. There we are. Scientists have determined that we need about 30% of the ocean protected. Now, maybe that's not going to happen, but it just shows you we need to keep pushing to get enough looked after so it perpetuates the fish stocks. It allows ecosystems to recover. We have a marine park and a bioregion set up around Australia, and there's 5 or so in New South Wales. Each was supposed to have a marine park with sanctuary zones within. The missing tooth in that lovely smile there is the Sydney Marine Park. That's been a story that is not bound by science or even rationales that I can see. It is in fact bound by people, as it should be, by the sociology, the political climate, etc., etc. It's to me a disgrace we only have 7% of New South Wales in no-take areas, and it's even more of a disgrace when we look at our beautiful Sydney coast. Even though we're a huge urban area, my colleagues overseas drool when they see like my first shot of Shelley Beach or these sorts of photos taken by some of the people here. They don't realise what a magnificent environment we do have. Climate change hotspot, it is rapidly changing, so we have to include climate change in whatever we think about. We have over 5 million people all loving the ocean or waste into the ocean, etc. Over 20% of the wreck fishes around Australia are in the Sydney region, so they're very important people to engage with and to help conserve the ocean. We know there are over 600 species of fish in Sydney Harbour that have been recorded. That's double the whole of New Zealand and the whole of England and most of Europe, so we're a pretty special place. Yet we only have less than 2% in reserves that are notated. What's going on? What's going on is I arrived here in 1994 and went very early on to see the ministers for fisheries and the environment. There was Ian McDonald, we all know what happened to him, and Bob Davis. And we seem to have the same conversation then as we might have today. So really, I've seen very little progress because there are obstacles in the way, I guess. And so you'll see a litany of promises, of anger, of old regional plans from 2000, etc. We don't need more science, we don't need more panels, a lot of science and scientists. We need conviction and across the board acceptance to do this, in my opinion. I'm just talking Sydney because really, you know, most of the human pressures there, but the other areas really need attention as well, in my opinion. That's not to say the marine environment, especially the coastal environment, isn't subject to a lot of other pressures. And you'll often hear, well, what's the point of having a marine protected area if you just stop the exploitation? What about some of these other things? Well, they are important too, but it turns out that marine park areas are good beachheads to look after these things as well. And a lot of plastics comes through some of the exploitation as well. So really, rather than obfuscate, we should consider these, get them in place, especially in a place like Sydney, and enforce them. So that's my 2 cents worth. So thanks very much. I'll leave it at that, and I'll ask Danielle Ryan to come up and I guess welcome, or us now. Danielle and James have arrived here recently from, where were you before this?
We're doing filmmaking.
Yeah, so they're amazing filmmakers, and I don't know if anyone's seen The Map to Paradise, one of the more amazing films. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's a world focus on the people involved with protecting the marine environment, including the fishers, the filmmakers, the conservationists. So we're going to hear from one of those in a minute. So I'll leave it over to Danielle to do a presentation.
Yes. Warm welcome on behalf of all the environmental NGOs here today, including the Australian Marine Conservation Society, the National Parks Association of New South Wales, Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales, Ocean Youth, the Wilderness Society, and WWF-Australia. My name is Danielle Ryan, and I represent AMCS and NPA New South Wales. Combined, our organisations represent more than 1.5 million genuine supporters who are passionate about protecting nature in their backyard. Since 2014, we have seen communities along the coast of New South Wales come out in support of marine sanctuaries and marine parks through film events and even a paddle out down in Batemans Bay Marine Park. Our work is ensuring that communities are united when it comes to improving protections for nature. Today is special because it's the first time bringing together stakeholders on the entire coastline of New South Wales to share their thoughts on the value and the future of marine sanctuaries. Zoom has made it possible to connect everyone from Byron to Batemans. Speakers will talk about the benefits of marine sanctuaries for biodiversity, tourism, and the community, including for fishing and the pure enjoyment of seeing nature. Keeping our coastline healthy is essential to sustain our way of life and for our regional economies. Thank you to UTS and to Professor Booth for making today's event possible. And thank you to all of the speakers for sharing your time with us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter. I'm the representative for the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. I joked to a colleague yesterday that it'd be kind of hard to condense my history and connection to oceans into just a few minutes, because in reality, I've been talking about this non-stop for about 20 years, and you can tell by my face, that's most of my life. Growing up on the Gold Coast, I've always felt a very strong connection to the ocean. Beach days, nippers, diving on the GBR. I was incredibly lucky. I mean, for several years I was 100% convinced that I was going to grow up into a mermaid, but alas. I first became upset with the way that older generations were managing our ocean resources when I was 6. I remember reading an article in the newspaper that stated plans to run giant oil tankers through the Great Barrier Reef. And I was feeling so angry looking at the gorgeous image of the reef and imagining it ruined by oil. So I did what every 6-year-old does. I wrote a letter to the PM. A few weeks later, I did get a return mail, and my parents were insanely excited. But all I remember is being dissatisfied, and I've remained dissatisfied. Because despite our best method of management and protection for our oceans, marine parks are still under threat, and the integrity of these ecosystems are still being undermined. Today, I'm a little bit more knowledgeable than I was when I was 6, a couple of degrees under my belt. And we have some absolutely amazing minds and people here today. We will hear from incredible researchers and passionate advocates. Today is an opportunity for us to come together and ensure that more kids will have the same opportunities I've had, being desperately disappointed when they don't grow a tail. We're here today because we all feel that call from Blue Horizons. But it's our job to make sure that everyone, not just people like me who are lucky enough to grow up on the coast, know about these issues. Because if people know about the oceans, people will care about the oceans. And if they care, they'll protect them.
Thanks, Peter. And in terms of my experience, I used to live on the northern beaches where I swam the 1.4k swim from Shelley to Manly across Coventry Bay Aquatic Reserve. The excitement never fades each time you see something special, like the shimmer of a school of fish flooded before your eyes. I love swimming across this sanctuary so much that I was doing half the swim across winter and into summer while pregnant until the day before I gave birth to my daughter. Unfortunately, shifting baseline syndrome means people have forgotten or have never seen what it's like to see the New South Wales seascape at its full potential, teeming with marine life. This is because our public space out in the ocean is like the Wild West. And it's been managed ineffectively over the past couple of 100 years since settlement. Over a 10-year period, researchers found some inshore Australian fish populations have declined by 31%. Yet evidence from around Australia and the world shows that marine sanctuaries are the best tools we have for replenishing these fish populations and for maintaining healthy marine ecosystems. This means we urgently need an improved system of governance off the coast of New South Wales to ensure this vast blue space, owned by all of us, the public, is managed in accordance with best practice science. Unfortunately, vital protections for marine sanctuaries have been eroded since 2013. While the rest of the world moves towards expanding protections, we are going backwards here in New South Wales. So much of our resources on the land and in the sea have been laid to waste. So how do we reverse this trend? Let's start by remembering that just 10% of the land and less than 7% of the sea is properly protected in New South Wales, areas that our communities have fought hard to protect. Protecting nature for future generations is about leadership. We urgently need community, scientific, and government leadership. When people like our international guest speaker today, Michael Sutton, are appointed into leadership roles, this is when real positive change occurs. Let today be one of those paradigm moments in conservation around marine sanctuaries. Everyone wants a bold vision to expand nature protections over our public resources. I'm standing up here today as a mum because my daughter doesn't have a voice on how our oceans are managed. Join me in ensuring that we establish more marine sanctuaries as an insurance policy for her future and for all of the ocean youth advocates here today, one that ensures biodiversity, climate, and food security. On behalf of the community groups, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Danielle and Peter, and I should also acknowledge Danielle and James's coral nurturing project. Those who know about coral nurturing, baby corals around. That's the future, I guess you'd say. And so just a reminder, we're going to hear from some wonderful people, but a key thing for me will be after 2 o'clock, we'll have a short, hopefully pointed discussion about where to go from here. So keep all these good ideas in your head as you listen to these talks. So what I will attempt to do now is get, sorry, Mike, can you hear me?
I can.
You're beautifully sounding around the room. So I've made you co-host, so you'll be able to share your screen when you're ready. Is that okay?
Great.
All right, excellent. So I'm very excited to have Mike here. I've seen him in celluloid. He was one of the featured people on Janelle and James' wonderful Map of Paradise. That's where I learned about his exploits with his father, travelling the world, understanding the different issues concerning marine protection, starting out as a park ranger, so right there in the midst of it all, and being instrumental in California's protected area program, including and impressively probably shaking the hands of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Is that right? That's a scary and interesting prospect. Anyway, so yes, in California, it's done some amazing things there to their marine for their marine protection. Mike is one of the instrumental. So without further ado, I will leave it to you, Mike, and love to hear what you've got to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's great to be here today. I spent 3 years at Sydney Uni in graduate school at one point in the dim, distant past. But today I'm speaking to you from the California coast, the Monterey Peninsula, where it's Thursday afternoon. And just by way of introduction, I'm a lawyer and a longtime marine conservationist and an avid sport fisherman as well. I was asked today to tell a brief story this morning about our experience creating and managing the largest marine protected area network in the United States, off our coast here in California. I'm going to share my screen and give you a brief presentation that I hope will introduce you to some of what we have done here on the California coast. It turns out that California and New South Wales have more in common than just eucalyptus trees. Both states have coastlines of similar length. They contain some of the most beautiful places on the planet where the ocean meets the coast, whether it's Manly in New South Wales, or which is almost as beautiful as the Big Sur coast right in my backyard here in California. These coastlines are really offer some absolutely stunning scenery, magnificent marine resources. This photo of the Big Sur coast, though, is a little deceptive because most of California's coast looks more like this, with lots of people living right on the coastline. New South Wales is twice the size of California in terms of land mass, but we have 5 times as many people in California as you do in New South Wales. 40 million people live in California, 8 million in New South Wales, and most of our 40 million people live just a few miles from the coast. Now, both California and New South Wales have jurisdiction over state waters out to 3 nautical miles offshore. And both states passed laws in the late 1990s establishing frameworks for creating marine parks and other protected areas. Now, I don't know about New South Wales, but in California, people care deeply about their coastline. We have lots of evidence over many decades of polling and public opinion research and press that Californians love the coast. And they love the coast not just because it's a great place to recreate and scuba dive and sail and fish and so forth. They love the coast also because they recognize that the economy, the ocean economy of California is very important. In fact, California's ocean economy is estimated to be worth close to $50 billion a year, whether it's fishing or tourism or shipping. It's worth a lot. The ocean contributes enormously to the California economy. The public is also aware, however, that our coast is under threat. And I'm talking about pollution, coastal development, overfishing, oil spills, and so forth. In fact, the public often believes that oil spills are the biggest danger to our coastline, but we have many years history and records and data that show that California's commercial fish landings have been declining, both in terms of of pounds landed and in terms of value. When the President of the United States responds to an oil spill of great magnitude, you can forgive the public for thinking that oil pollution is the biggest threat to our oceans. But actually, it's not. Scientists are pretty clear that oil pollution isn't the greatest threat to our oceans. It's actually carbon pollution brought on by climate change. You all know that. The public is beginning to be aware of that. Scientists tell us that this is the real threat to our oceans more than any other we've faced in a long time. Now, fortunately, we have a very well-established marine scientific community in California. And those scientists told us long ago that marine protected areas are one of the best ways to safeguard our ocean and coastal resources in California and anywhere else. Indeed, inside marine reserves, they tell us, the scientists tell us, fish are not only more abundant and more diverse, but they get bigger and they produce far more juveniles. And that's important to the ocean ecosystem, whether you're a scuba diver, a fisherman, or a conservationist. We have abundant evidence from many years' research that marine protected areas work and they help safeguard our ocean ecosystems. And it was because of that that in 1994, a group of sport fishermen out of Santa Barbara, California, on the Central Coast, just south of where I am here, a group of sport fishermen realized that their catches around the Channel Islands were declining. One of the interesting differences about California and New South Wales is you have a spectacular island, but it's 300 miles offshore, Lord Howe. We have spectacular islands too, but they're a lot closer to the coastline, and the Channel Islands are just a short boat ride away, a couple hours boat ride. And so there's a lot of fishing around these islands. And in 1994, sport fishermen saw their catches declining and lobbied the government to declare marine reserves, sized and spaced appropriately for the life histories of the species involved. So these were California's first real marine reserves. The no-take zones are in dark green and the associated protected areas in lighter colors. But this was so successful that it built public support for marine reserves in California, overwhelming public support, and it also built political support for our oceans. Governor Schwarzenegger may have been a conservative, but even in California, even conservatives have to be green. And Governor Schwarzenegger was green. He was very committed to creating conditions under which we could protect our oceans and our coast, because he realized how much public support we enjoyed for ocean and coastal conservation in California. So in 1999, almost just about the same time that New South Wales passed the Marine Parks Act, California passed something called the Marine Life Protection Act. And it, in both statutes, in New South Wales and in California, required that the government expand the protection for marine resources within state waters. Interestingly, after the statute was passed in '99, the government of California made 2 attempts to implement the law over the next several years. Scientists drew lines on a map, and state authorities held public meetings to gather public support and comment on these maps that the scientists had drawn. But the process ultimately failed because the public didn't have a say in the design of the MPAs. And so when Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor in 2003, he threatened to put the whole process on the back burner because it was too expensive and the state couldn't figure out how to do it right. So in response, several of us went to Schwarzenegger and we made him a deal. We created a public-private partnership that brought millions of dollars in private funding to help the state succeed in creating a new network of marine protected areas through an elaborate bottom-up process. California coast is so large that we had to create 4 separate stakeholder advisory groups to design this MPA network. Anyone and everyone who cared about the coast had a seat at the table. We did the Central Coast region first. In red are state marine reserves. In blue are state marine conservation areas where some fishing is permitted. The red are no-take zones. And you can see they're sized and spaced appropriately for the biology of the species that are involved. Let me show you how this system works here. Here's an example of a state marine reserve at Point Sur, just south of where I live here on the Central Coast. Point Sur is a spectacular area on the California coast. It's also home to the largest kelp forest, the largest persistent kelp forest on the California coast. And we decided to put that state marine reserve in red right over the top of that. It's like the redwood forest or the blue gum forest of the underwater world. It's spectacular. And so we decided to protect that kelp forest. Here's a closer view of the kelp forest and the state marine reserve over top. Offshore, however, in blue is a state marine conservation area where certain types of fishing are permitted, using mobile gear, no bottom contact gear, and so forth. So that you can see, it'll give you an idea of how this system works. We then moved to the north central coast, another example of where we sized and spaced these areas appropriately. Our goal was to conserve about 20% of the coastal ocean within marine reserves. And this included places like Point Reyes. Point Reyes on the north central coast is a great example of how we coordinated protection between land and ocean. Point Reyes has been a national seashore and part of our national park system for many years, but there was no protection offshore. So we created a marine reserve in the ocean waters off the coast here. And so in so doing, created ridges to reefs protection so that the seabirds that roost on those cliffs at Point Reyes have somewhere to forage and something to eat in the waters offshore. Finally, we took on Southern California, which was much more complicated due to the large number of people living adjacent to the coast. The Los Angeles basin is host to about 14 million people or so, if you count all the towns and cities in Los Angeles. So more people than in the entire state of New South Wales live in Los Angeles alone. And you can imagine the pressure from fishing organizations and other stakeholders and user groups. But we got the job done. And as a result, by 2012, when we finished, California now has 124 marine protected areas, 14 special closures around places like seabird colonies. 16% of California's state marine waters are protected, and 9% of our state's marine waters are in no-take reserves. So this network is smaller than New South Wales marine parks, but it's more distributed. And you don't have to go very far along the coast before you run into a protected area of one sort or another. Now, I accumulated a lot of scar tissue during this decade-long process and so did everybody else. But we realized that you can't just finish setting these areas up and walk away. You have to, it's very important to enforce the provisions of these marine protected areas and get the word out through outreach efforts to the people who live along the coast. Because if they don't support, if the coastal population doesn't support marine reserves, you might as well go home, and because it's not going to work. So outreach is really important. And the monitoring efforts and enforcement efforts are important too. We pledged, I served on the State Fish and Game Commission that set these marine protected areas up. And we pledged all of our stakeholders throughout the process that when we were finished, we would monitor these areas carefully and we would manage them in an adaptive fashion. That is to say, we would revisit the Marine Protected Areas Network 5 and 10 years and 20 years hence and figure out how to improve what we had done and how to manage them better. So I cannot stress enough the importance of an effective MPA management program that has outreach, research and monitoring, enforcement, compliance, and various components. The state of California right now is engaged in a 10-year review, a decadal review of its marine protected area network. And they undoubtedly, when that process is completed, they will make the necessary changes and adjustments to the areas that we created. I want to end on a positive note here. This was one of the things, I spent 8 years on the State Fish and Game Commission as appointed twice by Governor Schwarzenegger. One of the things I'm most proud of accomplishing during that tenure is California's Marine Protected Area Network, largest in the United States. But I also learned a lot during that process. And there are about 5 key factors that accounted for our success and makes this area a success today. This was not without controversy by any means. We had a number of lawsuits against the process. Various groups were unhappy about the process, but through it all, I realized that you need about 5 things to do this right. And I would submit that they apply across the board, not just in the US and not just in California. First of all, you need enough funding to do this properly, to pay for the science that you need to underpin marine protected areas, to pay for the monitoring that has to take place, to pay for the stakeholder groups to get together and to hire big enough venues, and of course, to pay for the wine that everybody has to consume having done all this difficult work. So funding mechanism big enough to handle the job is really important. And without the public-private partnership that helped the state fund this process, we would not be enjoying the largest network of marine reserves in the US today. There is no doubt about that. You also need a robust legal mandate, and we had that because of the state statute, the Marine Life Protection Act. You have that in New South Wales through your state law, the New South Wales Marine Parks Act. That's really important to underpin. You have to have statutory authority to establish and manage these areas. You also need strong scientific support. In fact, in California, we set up science advisory teams for each of the 4 regions of the coast. Those scientists had veto power over the stakeholder proposals that came forward. If a stakeholder proposal violated the biological bottom line, it didn't matter what political accommodations had been made. The stakeholders were told to go back to the drawing board, because it's one of the few public processes I've ever been involved in where scientists had veto power over the public process. That was really important. You have good scientists in New South Wales. We had good scientists in California. It's super important to engage them and keep their advice at the forefront. Probably the most important factor, though, and lesson learned, was that you cannot do this kind of thing top down. Governments can't do this by themselves. The stakeholders, all of them, have to be involved from day one in these processes to make them successful. Now, not everybody's going to get everything they want out of a stakeholder process, but everyone is going to have a say, and everyone is going to have an opportunity to participate in the design of these places and these processes. That is super important. And finally, you need political support at the highest levels of government. We had Governor Schwarzenegger. We worked hard to secure and maintain the support of the governor and the legislature. California is blessed with the ability to do many things before anyone else is able to do them. We brought the world seatbelts and airbags, and we have done many things in conservation first. And marine protected areas are a great example of that. But you can't do it without political support at the highest level. So I would submit that each of these 5 factors is necessary for a successful marine protected area process, wherever you are. And if you leave any one of them out, the whole thing can collapse. But if you have all of them and you manage to engineer all of them, you can create a really remarkable network of marine parks, marine protected areas that will remain viable for many years and ensure that all stakeholders, including fishermen, divers, boaters, and other groups, can enjoy a healthy and productive ocean and coast, whether it's in New South Wales or here in California. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and happy to answer questions if we have time, or do that later.
Thank you very much, Mike. Mike, I'm still stuck on scientists have veto power. The only people that seem to have veto power in New South Wales are some of the politicians who have overnight put amnesties and removed marine protection, and have also dropped proposals like City Marine Park. So hopefully, yeah, that's a pipe dream. But is anyone? We don't have a lot of time, but I really want to hear if there's any questions either from the floor here, or just check on the chat. There's one right here.
Coming from the scientists have veto power, how did you get that in? How did you build that in? Because it seems like that might seem to some other stakeholders like one gets more power than the rest. Like, how do you get that across that is an important thing to have in your structure?
Good question, and it wasn't easy. But first of all, scientists are not stakeholders. They science is just not just another special interest group, and we recognize that. Someone's opinion is not the same as the result of a peer-reviewed scientific investigation, and that's really important to keep in mind. We did not treat scientists as stakeholders, because they're not. They have superior knowledge, and the results of their many years of research along the coast deserves greater respect than that of just another stakeholder. The reason that we were able to create a situation where scientists had veto power over the proposals advanced by the public, by stakeholder groups, is that we wrote it into the process from the beginning. We created science advisory teams, both at the statewide level and the regional level, to provide advice and counsel to the stakeholders that were putting together these protected area proposals. And we wrote it in because we had the power of the purse. Remember, we had gone to the governor and got him to sign off on a public-private partnership that was paying for all this. We were paying for the scientists' time and paying for stakeholders to get together in venues in which they could operate and the technology they needed to do their work. And we told the governor, we are not going to pay for this unless you agree to do it right. And one of the ways to do it right is to give scientists veto power over stakeholder compromises, because after all, what good is a compromise, a political compromise, if it violates the biological bottom line? Won't do much good for ocean resources.
It's funny, we often hear this where scientists are stakeholders. If there was a medical issue, you wouldn't say surgeons are stakeholders. If it was a bridge building, you wouldn't say engineers were stakeholders, would you? But it's a funny world. Any other questions?
Australia's been described by Ben Midnight Oil as a redneck wonderland. We have an undercurrent in this country that is conservative, to say the least, in some ways. And one of the big issues in shooting down the Sydney Marine Park was shock jock radio people such as a guy by the name of Alan Jones and John Laws. How did you manage in California the negative press that you would have had to deal with as part of the process?
I think I got most of that question, but as I understood it, the question was, have we managed to engage all of the stakeholders, including fishermen who were dead set against the process? And, we had plenty of opposition to marine protected area, to creating marine protected areas in California. Fishermen who had access to the entire coast didn't want to give up their favorite fishing areas. Well, I understand that. I'm an avid fisherman myself. So we wanted to bring everybody who wanted to have a say in the design of these areas into the tent, onto the table. Some of the fishermen were reluctant to do that, but they realized that if they stayed outside the tent, they were going to be left behind, that others were going to design these areas without their input. And while no one got everything they wanted, many of the fishermen were instrumental in designing a practical approach to these marine protected areas. And we were able to successfully avoid some of their favorite fishing places along the coast. That was particularly important in Southern California, where there are a huge number of recreational fishermen and very powerful stakeholder groups. The recreational fishing groups filed 4 lawsuits against the funding process because they could tell it was going to work. All 4 lawsuits were dismissed by the courts because public-private partnerships in the United States are quite common. In healthcare and all kinds of other fields, there are many examples of private foundations and private funding being deployed to help the government achieve its objectives. And this was no different. And that really was one of the keys to our success. But I would say the most important key to our success, as I said before, was involving everybody from a very participatory design process from the bottom up. And whether they were redneck or educated didn't matter. They're all stakeholders and their views are all important.
Mike, we'd love to, I think I'd like to spend the rest of the day chatting to you about this. It's very, very interesting, but we've got a big schedule. Now, if you had, we're going to have a discussion in the afternoon, and rather than have a talk fest, if you have any particular points you think salient points we should ponder, feel free to just pop it in the chat there. We'll use your wide experience with these things. So with that, let's thank Mike again for a wonderful talk and question and answer.
Thank
you wouldn't mind, I'm co-host you, I guess. And then I see Vanessa's there ready to go with the ocean behind her. This next section is titled The Missing Bioregions from New South Wales Marine Park, Sydney and Eden, as we've alluded to already. And there's a bunch of quick fire talks here, which will be interesting because we obviously want to hear more from each of these people. But hi, Vanessa, welcome. And I won't even do introductions just because we don't have enough time. So if you want to introduce yourself, we'll go ahead. And away you go.
Well, good morning, everyone. I will just make sure that I'm a co-host just in case, because I've got some slides to share. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. And it's great that we're all meeting. This is a very timely discussion, and the work that I'll be sharing with you all today and presenting is about whales and humpback whale research in New South Wales waters, but talking about humpback whales around Australia because, well, these animals don't recognise state borders, international borders, and will essentially see the entire Australian coastline as their place to visit. Thank you for the co-host ability. That's great. Now I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so just letting you know, if you are doing social media, you're welcome to do so. Please do tweet along or whatever you use, because the more that people know that we're talking about this, it's really important. The more people know, the more that they can act. So I am coming to you from Macquarie University today from the Marine Predator Research Group. And also, if you don't know, we've just started a new citizen science project known as Wild Sydney Harbour. But without all of that in the background there, we'll put that away. The humpback whales in Australian waters, there's two populations. And for the international viewers and listeners, there's a population along the east and the west coast of Australia. And the East Coast population is the population that I work on. And the good news is, this is a very good news story, is that both populations in Australian waters are recovering post-whaling. So this is really good. So essentially, because we've stopped killing whales, they are now recovering. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case for all whales around the world, and particularly the southern right whale, which also visits our waters. Their recovery has not been as successful, and there are a few reasons why. But essentially, we do see the migration of many whales in Australian waters each and every year, and this time of year, which is our Australian winter, we are seeing many of these whales travel to warmer waters. And they'll be matching up the coastline on what we know as the Humpback Whale Highway. And this Humpback Whale Highway goes right through New South Wales waters. And as I said before, these animals don't recognise any boundaries, no international borders, state borders. These animals will use the coastline to their advantage to do what they need to do, which is to head north and to breed and then make their return back to Antarctica, where they'll spend the austral summer feeding. And these animals, just to give you an idea of scale, we're talking about an animal 17 meters in length. They're really big. They go to Antarctica. They feed primarily on krill. And when in Antarctica, they'll spend summer there enjoying their time. They'll do a lot of poo. There's a bit of whale poo for you. There's a bit of krill. Krill, they're around 1 to 2 centimeters in size. So essentially a really big animal feeding on small creatures as well. And then they'll head to the nice warm waters of the Coral Sea, the Great Barrier Reef. This is along the east coast. And then in the west coast of Australia, they'll head to the Kimberley, where they'll then spend that time with mothers will give birth to live young. And the males will attempt to reproduce with the next generation. So it is truly an annual spectacle that we are very fortunate to see. And in New South Wales, we do see these animals come up to our shore right now, very close to our shore, interacting with people at times. The tourism that these animals, the tourism dollar that these animals bring to the New South Wales coast is in millions. These animals are very, very valuable to us all, and it's our interest and our national and international obligations to protect them. And so as some of my research, we're obviously using innovative technologies to learn more about their health as these animals migrate. We're unable to simply ask for a blood sample or a COVID swab. So we have to be creative and use innovative technologies like drones to...
Vanessa, that's 5 minutes.
Yes, I'm very much aware of that. I'm coming back to the end now to collect health information from their lungs. But my main point here is to let you all know that we are now seeing changes in our marine environment, and in fact, very much in New South Wales waters, which brings upon us new observations of whale activity, which might be driven by these changes that we're not yet aware of. So recently we've seen that there's supergroup feeding events in New South Wales waters, which is a first for Australia. This has previously been documented in the waters of South Africa, and also the use of bubble net feeding. And so our research is trying to work out why we're only just now seeing this activity. And well, we know that humpback whales are recovering, so there could be a whole variety of factors, but some of these changes might be identifying these changes in environmental conditions that we need to learn more about. And then finally, we are simply not out of the woods yet. I did speak about these whales being a conservation success story, but we do have a number of threats that we need to manage that these animals are susceptible to. And so as a quick plug, if you'd like to learn more about the marine world, there is Southern Ocean Live, which was a live event that happened last week. It's available to stream on iView right now. And thank you all for your attention, and I hope that the forum goes well.
Thank you very much. If you would mind unsharing. And our next speaker is Gary Dunnett, who's the president of the National Parks Association. Right? CEO.
Okay, thanks everyone. I just want to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respect to Elders Parks present and emerging. I was asked by Danielle and James to talk about Sydney Marine Park and Two-Pole Bay. I'm really bad at volume construction, so what I'm actually going to do instead is just to give a little test case. Items actually gives us a couple of things for hope, and that's actually the situation we have in Botany Bay and the history of how we got to where we are at Botany Bay. So on one level, Botany Bay is one of the most urbanised catchments in Australia. It's also one of the most heavily utilised from an infrastructure and industry perspective. It's got an oil refinery, it's got a sewage treatment plant, a massive sewage treatment plant. It's got a desalination plant, it's got the airport, it's got the port, it's got the mega cemetery, the other day on ABC I heard them refer to as death gardens. But it's got this extraordinary intensity of development adjacent to those suburbs. And Botany Bay is a remarkable landscape for the middle of the city in terms of the conservation state that we actually have in this place. So Botany Bay has got two headlands of the embayment are actually protected as part of Kamay Botany Bay National Park. The northern headland, there's the Cape Banks Aquatic Reserve, which sort of fringes that northern headland. Just to the south, we've got Boat Harbour, which protects an incredibly important flyway site for migratory waders, as well as having a whole swag of marine values. And I guess the real jewel that I want to talk about predominantly is Tara Point. And Tara Point's this lovely juxtaposition of a nature reserve for the terrestrial values and an aquatic reserve that surrounds Tara Point. Okay. All right. So I guess the big question is, how do we get there? And, it looks like any landscape, there's a long history. It actually goes back to Thomas Holt in the 1870s in terms of setting some of it aside. But I actually think that there's one figure I want to concentrate on, and it's a fellow in this picture by the name of Bernie Clark. Bernie Clark was this extraordinary conservationist. He passed away about 4 years ago now. I first met Bernie as a 16-year-old at school, and I was so excited because he was a monthly columnist with Bottom Fishing, and his wife Bill also did a column with Bottom Fishing. And Bernie was this character who'd been a soldier in PNG and had these amazing stories of being a professional fisherman up there and then a patrol officer. But Bernie was also quite willing to take one of the 16-year-olds out into Tara Point. And the reason was that he had this extraordinary tale to tell, partly about the history of the site, so this is to do with the creation of the causeway, but it was actually about the way the place came to come together. So we talked about the sieges up on the salt marsh systems themselves, and the extraordinary productivity that came out of the salt marsh systems. The mangroves, and again, the history, this is one of the original fences by the Holts from the 1890s. The way that And I've got to say, for me, this was the bit going around towering Bernie's little Quintrex. It's the first time I'd actually been into mangroves at high tide and really got that sense of what it feels like to be captured in them. And then on to the Zostra seagrass beds, close inshore ones, Posidonia and the extraordinary history of Botany Bay in terms of that big shallow bowl that it is. All right, so that was an amazing experience for me as a 16-year-old, and then off to university, down to Tasmania to work for parks there. And 20 years later, I came to Botany Bay with my shiny new National Parks Area Manager uniform. And I got this call from this cranky character, Mr. Clark, asked me what I was going to do about the freckled duck. And I've got to say it threw me, because I'm a birdo, but I had no idea why he was talking about freckled ducks, a western species. But I said, started the conversation, and what became clear was that the freckled duck was the one threatened species at the time of the boom. We knew of it was at Tara, because most of the migratory waders at that point weren't actually classed as threatened. And so, yeah, that was the whole. And what Bernie was doing was saying, we've got a problem here, and the problem that he was pointing to was this extraordinary erosion of Tara, which was a consequence of the past half dozen campaigns he'd been involved in. The one against the oil refinery, he was so proud about being a wagon in 1951 opposing the construction of the oil refinery. The port, the airport, and those changes to the morphology of Botany Bay had cascaded so that we had to change wave regime, we had to change sand transport, and it was destroying the freshwater habits in Tara, but it was also destroying Tara Spit Island, the habitats for all of those iconic international species that we see around Tara. And Bernie and I, within a year of that, we're down talking to the Commonwealth Environment Minister, Robert Hill, about what he was going to do about Tara. We had this extraordinary funding package, and Bernie was able to convince the State Minister to put $1 million into beach renourishment on Tara. The thing I take out of this is someone for whom fishing was his heart and soul. But he understood you need to maintain, you need to protect the bedrocks of that system. And that means all of those ecosystems that are feeding into the productivity. And I think the legacy we've got on Tara is an extraordinary one. It's actually giving us a cue about how we can have our cake and eat it too. It's not 30% yet, but it's not that far off 30%. And it is a damn sight better than we have across most of the New South Wales coastline. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary, for that unexpected plug for Botany Bay. It is an amazing place if you took away the oil refineries and the removal of the seagrass and that sort of thing. It really is. So thanks for pointing that out. Next, we have a couple of short videos from Tricky Nichols, who's many people know him as the amazing owner of Manly Dive Centre. And so it's really good to hear from someone, a stakeholder like that, his views. So can you guys look from there?
Through some inspirational thinking many years ago, we were able to protect a little slice of heaven called Cabbage Tree Bay. We've got, about an acre or so of a marine estate that's fully protected from hunting and gathering and fishing and collecting. So we've got a beautiful no-take aquatic reserve, which is enjoyed by swimmers, snorkelers, divers, and is a fantastic source of tourism. 20 years ago, our dive shop and the local, some people from the Manly Environment Centre got together along with some scientists. We conducted some surveys at our local dive site and found that there were some specific protected species there. And also, because of our proximity to Manly and our proximity to Sydney, the area had a lot of different uses and very high usage. So we looked at ways of maybe protecting this small area for the future. And what eventuated was Cabbage Tree Bay No-Take Aquatic Reserve. From there, we've had an amazing response. For the first 15 years, things really didn't change much, but from 15 years onwards, the fish life just blossomed and the popularity of the area blossomed. And we really feel now for our local community, it's a little bit of a diamond in the rough. There's this very small area of Sydney that's got full marine protection, and the benefits to all the community have been absolutely extraordinary. So really my appeal to everyone out there is to come on board and give marine protection the front and centre that it really needs. We've seen a bit of a shift in the political landscape, certainly here in Australia over the last year, and you can see how, you know, people's focus is on the environment. Certainly in my area, Cabbage Tree Bay is critical to our local environment. It's also critical to a lot of local businesses, and we've had snorkeling businesses and cafes and a whole lot of spin-off businesses that have benefited hugely from the aquatic reserve. We've also got an opportunity to showcase that and get local schools and schools from all over Sydney who could use that as a study case for this is what we can do if we can protect the local marine life. So there's a lot of reasons why protecting the marine life is good. We've got one, obviously the marine life themselves benefits. We as local residents benefit with a fantastic resource that's absolutely totally renewable, and providing we keep up the protection, then it will last for our grandchildren and their grandchildren and their grandchildren. We've got a great recreational facility for locals. We've also got an amazing showcase facility for people visiting Sydney. If you come to Sydney and you come to Manly, there's some pretty iconic reasons to come here. We've arguably got, you know, the best beaches in Sydney, but also we've got the best marine reserve in Sydney. And we find that's very powerful. We've also got great scientific benefit to having that marine reserve there, and I'm sure the scientists and others will talk about that a little bit more later. But we've also got a great educational benefit and a great benefit to show our children what we can do if we put our mind to conservation and just say, well, here's a little bit of paradise and we're going to save it. And one of, I think, the saddest moments for me in the last decade was to see the Sydney Marine Park, basically, the whole process fall over. It was very sad. We put, you know, all thousands of hours, collective hours of work in, and to see that, you know, the political will not being there to drive that forward, you know, that was very sad. Hopefully, you know, that can come back on the table and people, you know, in the appropriate places will see the wisdom of investing in our backyard and investing in our underwater world. So really that's my bit. You know, I'm pretty passionate about it, but I've seen firsthand for the last 20 years the amazing benefits to everyone in our community. Manly's been the winner, the residents have been the winner, our children have been the winner with education, and even our fishermen have been a winner with increased fish stocks. So when we look at all this, I would love you guys to come on board. If there's any way any of you can help at any point, then please do, because now is the time to do something. Now is the time to act. Thank you.
Amazing guy who's right at the forefront of marine conservation. Can we rapidly put it on to the next one's another one of these, right?
Yeah.
It's Phil Dorset of Ruby Lane Cafe in Manchester.
All right, hey guys, my name's Phil. I run Ruby Lane. It's a cafe down in Manly. And I love being in the Manly community, and I think it's because it's a community that's completely surrounded and involved with a natural resource at the beach and Shelley Beach, and particularly the Marine Reserve. And there's something special about a community that's around that. I think just knowing that within 5 minutes of wherever you are in Manly, you can just jump in the water. No matter how stressed out you are, you can just be in there, immersed in nature and be a million miles away from all your worries. And it just makes me think of even like over in Japan, there's doctors that are specifically prescribing to stressed out people with mental health issues to go and spend more time in nature. I'm just like, well, how lucky are we? We've got that right on our doorstep. But anyway, I'm here to talk to you more about the economy and money today, and the incredible impacts that a natural resource like this can have on our local economy. I've successfully run 4 businesses over the past 12 years, and any time before I embark on a new venture, I always look at the return on investment. And I just want to ask you this one important question. Imagine I came to you and I said there was an investment that had the following qualities. It generated new jobs, it generated a boost to GST revenue, generated a boost to stamp duty, PAYG, in fact, most tax revenues, generated a boost to tourism, generated a boost to hospitality. In fact, it generated a boost to all sorts of sectors: transport, legal, accounting, retail, fashion, construction, the list goes on. And all you had to do was nothing. You probably think I'm crazy or I'm trying to show you some kind of new crypto project or something. But seriously, all we've got to do is give nature the space and she does the development. We don't have to go out there and build a new stadium. We don't have to build a new railway. We don't have to build a big new building. Nature does the building for us. And then the private sector does the rest. I mean, you think the boathouse would have gone down to Shelley Beach and spent over $5 million and building a beautiful restaurant and function centre if there wasn't a marine reserve down there? I asked Andrew, who owned the boathouse at the time, and he said no, they definitely would not have. You know, there's a cafe down at the bottom of Manly Surf Club there that does over 100 kilos of coffee a week. This place isn't even 8 square metres in size. You know why they're so popular? Because they're at the beginning of the Manly to Shelley swim. I also spoke with the owners of the 2 biggest real estate agents on the northern beaches, Upstate Realty and Cunningham's. I asked them, do you think there's been an impact on the property values along Bower Street and along the fringe of this marine reserve in Manly? And they said, obviously there is. I asked the general managers of the Novotel, Q Station and the Siebel Hotel what the #1 attraction in Manly was that they would always recommend to all of their guests. And you know what they said? I think you get the picture. Look, so what I'm saying is we're always looking for ways to boost the economy, right? And it can be really expensive. But the way I look at it is we've got the natural resource. It's already there. We don't have to build anything. We just need to let it do its thing. And the private sector will chase after it. I would want to open a cafe that's right near a marine reserve. A hotelier wants to build a hotel that's right near a marine reserve. So let's keep this in our mind when we're looking at new projects, when we're wanting to protect new ones, and let the rest just unfold, and we won't regret it. Thank you.
So next we'll hear from Alex Rigg, who's an interesting character. There it is right there. I mean that in the best possible way. He's coming to our lab as a school teacher, a avid recreational fisherman, and also a scientist. So I've asked him to give a bit of perspective from maybe a slightly more fisher angle about the whole process. So,
beautiful. So my name is Alex, and I'm going to speak to you today as a PhD student, a high school teacher, and leader. So the one common theme underlying my triple life is I'm an ocean lover and science nerd. I remember growing up watching Rex Hunt on TV, and he was fishing at Narrabeen Lakes. He caught his own nippers and landed some bream and whiting. And as a 10-year-old, I wanted to do just that. So Mum and Dad bought me a rod and line, and I haven't stopped fishing since. I travel up and down the coast chasing pelagics, and in the off-season I love catching squid and drummer. It takes me far and wide, and to be honest, it's not so much about catching the fish anymore than it is about the interaction and understanding of the beautiful coast that we live in. In Sydney, I predominantly fish an area called bluefish, and named that because it was once inhabited by the bluefish, but it can no longer be found there. Bluefish is just adjacent to one of our few no-take zones, Cabbage Tree Bay, and you probably think it's a bit ironic that I'm fishing right near a marine sanctuary, but fishers love the spillover effect from marine parks, and bluefish is a fantastic example of this. My research involves these little guys up there, a top left, they're a bit like Nemo. They come down in the current from the warmer waters and they settle on our rocky reefs. Fantastic research going on about these tropical vagrants, and unfortunately we'll probably be seeing a lot more of them in the not distant future. I'm basing my talk today around three key questions. Is the proposal trying to preserve, conserve, or be a representative section? How is the plan going to be resourced and implemented, and the potential role of citizen science, and where's Sydney at? So, is the proposal trying to preserve, conserve, or be a fragmented and representative section? From all the reading I've done of Tara, the proposal, the technical paper, I can see these plans having a very conflicting strategy that could potentially result in a lose-lose situation unless the science is listened to and integrated within the proposal. Long story short, climate change, stronger and warmer current, recruitment of herbivorous and tropical fishes, and more significant weather events. What does this look like in 20, 30, 40 years? Well, more storms, less kelp, more tropical fish in temperate areas, and the simplification of our habitats. There's no one good answer, but having a big hole in our representative areas will definitely have repercussions because it neither adapts to climate change, conserves, preserves, or is a representative section. When I see the language in the proposal like mitigate and adapt, and the research on the interventions that actually mitigate and adapt, there's a disparity that isn't addressed by the processes and the plan. It is amazing to have an aspirational policy, but there's aspirational and there's unrealistic. In my 25 years of recreational fishing, guess how many times I've been checked by the DPI? None. With the proposed changes and improvements of this proposal, I struggle to comprehend how all these objectives will be monitored, maintained, enforced, and reflected upon. Other speakers today will probably be highlighting the success of the marine sanctuaries like Cabbage Tree Bay from an ecological perspective, but the true success of this reserve is not so much the science than it is the people who drive it, the locals. Isn't it the dream for policy and politicians? A community-driven, self-sustaining, self-advertising policy in action. Drawing upon my leadership experience in running projects and initiatives in schools, the project is destined to fail if the people who are driving it don't see its purpose, or as I say at work, the why. A perfect example of this is the recent slot limit of the flathead. It's been an unwritten rule of recreational fishers as long as I can remember to throw back the big ones. The recent changes by the DPI to introduce the slot limit, well in my circles anyway, was unargued, as it was practicing culture and we understood the why. These are the people that will be your eyes and your ears and your cultural enforcers. These are the people that will uphold the community to this policy's aspirational goals, not because they're the rules, but because they truly believe its purpose. I would love to see the infrastructure for citizen science to be able to monitor, maintain, enforce, and reflect upon the effectiveness of marine parks. We all know what works well, and yet it's absent within the architecture of the proposal. And where's Sydney at? I just don't get it why there's a big gap here. I struggle from a scientific lens, from a community lens, from an ocean lovers lens. Sydney is in a very vulnerable spot in terms of climate change, just on the cusp of subtropical, but not cold water year round. When we look at the tropicalisation of temperate areas, Sydney's in a very interesting spot. But it's not just that. Look at the population densities. Every other populated area has a marine park, and I'm guessing this isn't a coincidence. And you don't have to be a scientist to understand the amount of impacts we have on our waterways. Only look as far as Cabbage Tree Bay to see what a successful management looks like. We're missing the chance to engage people in something amazing, but Sydney will be disengaged. And finally, we are missing the biggest opportunity on a global level, to be leaders in creating a model that works and engages people. So policy, processes, and management is far too often reactive to crises or situations. And with climate change, we can't afford to be reactive. We'll always lose. The momentum to temporal scales associated with climate change is far beyond the timeframe of one generation and one government term. So in my eyes, this will be one of the last opportunities to be able to mitigate and adapt rather than firefight against something we cannot fix. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That's very inspiring. And he did mention I guess we might call it the coming of age of citizen science in the marine environment. One of the champions of that to me is the next speaker, Dr. John Turnbull, University of New South Wales, or is it University of Sydney? John, known for many years, and not only is he scientist, recent PhD in marine science, he's also a social scientist, business person in the past, and president of the Underwater Research Group, which is probably one of the world's oldest dive clubs that's engaged with science. So he presides over the New South Wales branch of the Australian Marine Science Association, and which delivers a lot of science statements and is also engaged in the incredible frustration of getting this moving forward. So love to hear from John.
Thanks, Dave.
You want to hear something?
Yeah, I'm going to say it all with you. Sharing.
Literally like that. Yeah.
So while Dave's finding my prezzo for me, thank you. That's it. I'd like to say hi to everyone here in the room and online, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Indigenous custodians of the land on which we all are here today, and the land on which I live, which is the Wallumettagal people on the north shore of the Parramatta River.
So this is the worst maths in the world.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for asking me to talk to you all here today. I'm a social ecologist, which is not an ecologist that's friendly. I'm an ecologist, although there are friendly ecologists. But I study the interaction between marine and coastal ecosystems and humans. So I look at both. I look at things like biodiversity and whether or not the ecological systems are working, but also how they work together with humans. So I explore things like social values and management, such as marine protected areas and stewardship. I also happen to be the president of the New South Wales branch of Australian Marine Science Association, which is why I'm presenting today. So first of all, a little bit about science. We've heard about scientists being more than stakeholders, and I do believe that. I believe scientists have a lot more to contribute than just a stakeholder. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the Australian Marine Science Association is, in our view, the peak body for marine scientists in Australia. We cover all areas of marine science and also all areas of Australian systems, so coral and temperate, tropical and temperate and subtemperate. And we have been advising and providing support for marine scientists for over 50 years. We currently have over 700 members, scientist members. And we produce position statements as a way of summarising the science in certain areas. So we have a position statement on climate change, one on the importance of taxonomy, and we have a position statement on marine protected areas. So this is an attempt to say, well, what does the science tell us about marine protected areas? And we update these. So the latest one is 2019 on marine protected areas. So I'm going to explain to you 7 key points that are in our position statement, and then I'm going to use a piece of research that I did a few years ago as an example, and try to then summarise with where are we at in New South Wales. So the first key point in our position statement is MPAs are vital to conservation of biodiversity and biomass, the amount of fish and the diversity of fish, as well as invertebrates and habitat. But in order for that to happen, they need to be well designed and managed. And the best way of summarising that is to refer to CAR principles: comprehensive, adequate, and representative. So a simplification of that is comprehensiveness. Means, do they cover all of our bioregions? And we've heard already today they don't. The second one is adequacy. Are they strong enough to deliver what they are aimed at delivering, such as conservation of biodiversity? And finally, are they representative of all of the variation within those regions? And the summary of the science, whilst there's thousands of papers that look at this, there are a few summary points. One is, in order for you to conserve, protect, and even improve biodiversity and biomass, you need in the order of 30% sanctuary zones.
So that's a rule of thumb, if you like. There are variations to that thing, but that's a good rule of thumb. The four other aspects that we make key in our position statement are we want to design marine protected areas. In order for them to work, they should follow a set of principles that were laid down in 2014 called the Neolin principles. Now, the first one we've already talked about, it's an acronym. They should be no-take, that's the N. The other four, and this is published in Nature, which is the premium target publication for scientists. The other four are, they need to be effectively managed and enforced. E. They need to be old, so left in place for a long time. We heard Tricky say it took 15 years for that to start to come back. They need to be large enough to protect ecosystems. And the final one is the best ones are also isolated. In other words, they have a degree of natural isolation, so the fish stay, if you like, within that area. So those five principles also give us a guiding framework for effective marine protected areas. We also at AMCS believe strongly that this balanced approach of involving all stakeholders is very important, but we feel that scientists and researchers are more than key stakeholders. We are also potential partners in the design and management process. We are the ones who understand the evidence. We can act as both stakeholders in that we want marine parks so we can do our research in them, but also we can help to make sure they're effective. Marine protected areas are an integral part of ecosystem-based fisheries management. Instead of just managing fish stocks in terms of can we catch enough fish, we want to be managing the ecosystems that support those stocks. And MPAs are a very important part of that. And the final piece, which we heard from Mike Sutton as well, is in order for them to be effective, we need to monitor them, make sure they're meeting the objectives over time. So there are 7 key points in the AMCS position statement. Now I'd like to just reflect a little bit on MPAs in New South Wales. First of all, the legislation, this is from the Marine State Management Act, is very clear. The primary purpose of MPAs is an ecological purpose. The purpose is to conserve biological diversity and maintain ecosystem integrity and function of bioregions in New South Wales. That pretty well says it all. Now, only once you've done that can you turn your attention to the secondary goals. Because if we don't achieve increased biodiversity and biomass, all of these secondary goals won't be achieved. So we need to remember that if we don't design marine protected areas that actually work ecologically, we're wasting our time in terms of social or political or other objectives. So it's very important, I think, to keep that primacy of objectives clear in what we're trying to do with MPAs. Because we do tend to get caught up in, well, we need to make everyone happy. Well, that's fine, but no one will be happy unless the MPAs actually deliver an ecological outcome first. So, do those MPAs meet CAR principles? I'm going to take the C and the R first, and then I'm going to talk about the A, because the C and the R are about coverage. Are they comprehensive? Well, no, they're not. There are 2 bioregions that have no large ecosystem scale MPAs. The small aquatic reserves in the Sydney region are helpful, but they're not big enough to protect the ecosystems in this region. And we also want them to be representative. Now, we think of the ocean as this big amorphous mass. It's a whole collection of ecosystems. And in the IUCN topology of ecosystems, there are 21 marine ecosystems. What I don't see happening is I don't see there being an inventory of, in this region, of these 21 ecosystems, we have 16 of them. And of those 16, these are the levels of protection of each ecosystem. How much kelp forest is protected in this marine park? How much coral reef exists and is protected? How much photo limited Girl Love scientists, don't you? Photo limited marine animal frost, sponge gardens. How much sponge gardens do we have in the Sydney region, and how much of it is in a particular area? So we want to actually understand the diversity of ecosystems and how well each of those is protected. And our goal is 30% of each ecosystem protected within the MPA. Now the A of adequacy, how adequate is protection? Well, we've heard already around 7% on New South Wales waters are in sanctuary zones. That means 92.5% isn't. We think of our goal of 30% protection, even within our MPAs, we only achieve 19% sanctuary zone. So we don't have adequate protection. There is no MPA in New South Wales that achieves 30%. Solitary Islands is 12, the biggest is Lord Howe with 28. We talk about the Sydney Marine Park, and I was a strong supporter of it because it was a positive step, but it only proposed 2.4% sanctuary zone. Okay, just see the trend here. We're calling things marine parks, but we're not designing them to succeed. The other 2 points, which has come up already as well, enforcement is insufficient. We're not investing enough once we put in place marine parks. We don't invest in enforcing them, and we don't invest in monitoring them enough to know whether they're achieving the goals. As Dave said, I'm a citizen scientist as well as a scientist. I do reef life surveys, which are volunteers. I've just come back from surveying in Seal Rocks. We did 6 sites in 3 days. I don't see that consistent monitoring in marine parks being done and reported. Where's the report card of the uplift in fish species and fish diversity and fish biomass in our marine parks? Where's that report card? Where's the report card of the improvements in habitat that have flowed from these habitat protection zones? The reality is that the Reef Life Survey volunteers that go out and survey every year are probably contributing one of the best data sets to understanding what's happening in our marine parks. And we're all volunteers. So to me, if the government is responsible for marine protected areas, they need to be investing in a monitoring program. Fine, cover the cost of the volunteers, but do it systematically, do it in a way that's reported, and do it in a way that's supported. Take responsibility for the outcomes of marine protection. So just to illustrate, this is some research. How long have I got, Dave?
Just a couple of minutes.
This is just to illustrate, we talk about sanctuary zones, right, and how important they are. This illustrates why they're so important. This is a study I had published in Conservation Biology a couple of years ago. So this we did 56 sites from Port Stephens around Perth, 31 of those sites were in New South Wales. And we looked at 16 criteria, 6 of them social and 10 of them ecological. And we said, do marine parks work? Are they better than areas outside marine parks? And we split it into partially protected areas, so parts of the marine park that are open to fishing, and fully protected areas or sanctuary zones. So on one of those 16 criteria, you can see here, species richness, areas outside marine parks, around 12 species per 50 metre transect. Partially protected areas inside marine parks but open to fishing, no better. Fully protected areas, about 50% uplift in species richness. These are the 16 criteria. I don't have time to go through it, but a green arrow pointing upwards is better. You can see that partially protected areas are no better than areas outside marine parks on any of our 16 criteria. 10 of which were ecological and 6 of which were social. Fully protected areas had more fish diversity, biomass and large fish biomass. They didn't have a measurable impact in areas outside the fish part of the system, because there could be a number of factors there. Maybe the effect is too small for us to detect, but also maybe we don't yet have enough fully protected areas for the flow-on effects of improved fish populations to then start to show up in other parts of the system. But look at the social indicators. So this one here was Are there more of certain users? So you'd think if partially protected areas were an attraction to people, you'd find more of certain types of users in them, maybe fishers. There are no more fishers inside partially protected areas than there are outside marine parks. So they're not an attraction. However, there's twice as many scuba divers, 3.5 times as many snorkelers in fully protected areas. Why? Because we ask them, why do you come here? In fully protected areas, people would say, I come here for the marine life, it's better. They wouldn't say that in partially protected areas. Or they'd say, I come here because it's a protected area that works. They wouldn't say that in partially protected areas. And when we ask them, has this area improved over time, they would say yes if they were in a fully protected area, and no if they were in a partially protected area. So my point here is this: if you build a marine protected area that delivers ecologically, then you derive the social benefits that we seek. Okay? That's the way to make these areas work socially as well as ecologically. So, in order to achieve real protection in New South Wales, I believe we need to design MPAs that are comprehensive, adequate and representative. That means delivering on ecological performance as the primary objective to then have the flow-on effects. That means plugging the gaps in the bioregions, prioritising sanctuary zones, not 2.4%, 24%. Design marine parks that have enough true protection that they actually deliver. And we need to be publishing the results so everyone can see with their own eyes that when you fully protect an area, marine life comes back, and when you don't do a good job, it doesn't work. Ensure that scientists are more than stakeholders that are actually part of the process of making these things work. And if we are going to hit 30% by 2030, let's make it a real 30%, not a 10-30%. Thank you. So these are some of the references behind what I just said. Thank you very much.
It's a very important presentation, and I think it's time to call out the habitat protection zones. They're a fallacy. Not only are they of no value, they're of negative value because people add them to the sanctuary zone to say, look at all the marine protection we've got. Absolute rubbish. So let's concentrate on no-take areas from now on. I don't want to hear about habitat protection zones, to be honest. All right, so we are a bit behind, but we're now, where are we? We're going to have a little bit of a foray with some vignettes into the Cape Byron Marine Park. So I'm not sure which ones of these are live, which ones are on Zoom. So the first one is a diamond view, I believe.
G'day. Look, I can't share my screen at the moment because you've got it locked. So if you could do that, would be good. So I'm speaking from Byron Bay. I'm on Arakwal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I can now share. Okay. So my expertise is in building car parks, basically. I'm not very good at it, and I never seem to get them finished. But after the adoption of the CAR principle in the 1992 National Forest Policy, I spent 10 years trying to build car parks over forests. And over the decade from 2003, I had to go with the marine environment. It's a lot harder to build car parks out of water when you can't see what you're doing. We've just had a description of what CAR is, a comprehensive, adequate and representative reserve system. So it's important to recognise that it's not just at a bioregional scale, it's at the ecosystem and the habitat scale that we need these CAR reserve parks. We need to ensure they encompass the full range of ecosystems and that they encompass the variation within those ecosystems, the habitats within them, and that they be adequate. And so, adequacy, as we've been told, is, 30 to 50% or 20 to 50%. There's been various figures. But that is of each ecosystem or habitat, not of the bioregion, and that's in strictly protected reserves. And so in the marine environment, our trouble is that we don't really know what's down there over a lot of the marine system. And so we use surrogates for it. And what the first surrogate is, they identify bioregions using ecological data where there's similar species distribution. And within those bioregions, they need to then stratify it. And one of the main ways of doing that is by either the substrate type, which is usually very limited, so it's either reef or marine sediments. Sometimes they differentiate within them. And the other one is water depth, because our species change with the depth of water, and there's very significant changes in species as you go down deeper. In our estuaries, we have seagrass, mangrove, salt marsh, mudflats that are usually mapped, and we can use those, and they are habitats. But there's also special areas in the marine environment, the whole range of them, but unfortunately, we don't have information on most of those, but where we do have it, we need to use it. So I was involved from 2003 as the conservation representative on the Cape Byron Marine Park Advisory Committee, and our task was to advise on the zoning of it. Now, that's within the Tweed-Moreton bioregion, and so that covers about 231,000 hectares of New South Wales marine waters, north from Nambucca Heads and out to 3 nautical miles. So within that area, we also had the Saltry Islands Marine Park. So we had the 22,700 hectare Cape Byron Marine Park and the 71,000 hectare Saltry Islands Marine Park, which gives us 40% of the bioregion. The trouble was that only 3.9% was fully protected at that time in the Saltry Islands Marine Park. So nowhere near our 30% goal. So when I started, I knew very little. So I did lots of research. You know, that was my first task, was to bring myself up to speed with why marine sanctuaries are important, and to present that information to the rest of the committee so they can understand as well. And I spent a lot of time snorkeling to try to familiarise myself with the marine environment, because I had done quite a bit with a kid, but I just wasn't up to speed. And my key lessons I think I learned from that process is that there's abundant science, even back then, even back in 2003, there was abundant science about the importance of fully protected marine reserves. And I also understood that how the CAR Marine Reserve principles were applied as well. And they're our strongest allies, and we need to use them whenever we can. I also learned that high targets are essential. Apart from anything else, you need a place you can negotiate from, and we've got abundant evidence there that we need these high targets. And we need to do better informing and bringing the community with us. That's one thing we didn't do so well. We had a go at it, but really, I think we failed on that measure. So the outcome was that we got 27% of the Cape Byron Marine Park in sanctuary zone, including some significant and worthy areas. But this only increased reservation to 6.5%.
We're not hearing at the moment, and you've been going for about 6 minutes. So if you come back on, would you just make a few final points?
Like 50% in sanctuary zones. That was our attempt. So they're the pink areas.
6 minutes. So if you wouldn't mind just consolidating the points.
Okay. And all right. So I'm over time already. So the outcome is on the right, really. So I won't go into details there. And then I moved on to the Temperate East Marine bioregion, and there you'll see down the bottom there's the Cape Byron Marine Reserve on the left, and then there's all this massive ocean out there to the east. A clear example of how the federal government ignored the CAR Reserve criteria and delivered a grossly inadequate reserve. So this is a part of that Temperate East region off northeast New South Wales. And from our time, I'll get to the final point, which is it sounds, now after the state and federal processes, we have 26% of the region basically off New South Wales in marine parks, but only 4% of it is fully protected. So we're well short of what's required. And New South Wales marine parks are part of the problem. They pretend to be conservation reserves, when the majority is business as usual. They represent a part of a bioregion within which we are forced to argue for bits to be protected. They include other significant sites within the bioregion. We are reduced to protecting parts of priority areas with the lowest fishing values. And while terrestrial parks are generally sacrosanct, zoning is changed at political whim. So we don't have multiple-use land parks, so why should we have multiple-use marine parks? I think we need to undertake assessments on a bioregional basis rather than first identifying marine parks. Let's just drop that step altogether. Promote at least 30% in fully protected marine sanctuaries rather than in marine parks. Promote variable targets for ecosystems and habitats up to 100%, depending on their extent, rarity, and vulnerability. Identify sites with exceptional biodiversity values for full protection. Zone outside reserves to limit trawling and other damaging processes. But I think what we need to do now is propose priority marine sanctuaries we're aware of without waiting for bioregional assessment. We need to consider them within that context, but we need to get them up on the agenda now. And I think we need to promote accessible shore-based snorkeling havens. They're just so important for people to experience that recovering marine environment. And my final point is, let's not forget about freshwater sanctuaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolan. Some very good points, some specific, but some of them are sadly played out across New South Wales. Thank you. All right, so next we have a very perspective, Indigenous perspective. If I can just in the dark there. Yeah, that's all right. And we're going to hear from Darby, a free-diving custodian of the Northern Rivers. Is that one?
So he's not currently on the Zoom call. I think he's having internet issues.
We might
so we might just go past and come back.
I want to hear about it, but I'm also going, oh, we've got some time. That's and then the next speaker is Angel Grimaldi. Oh, there you are. Hello, Angel. Sorry.
Angel is good.
There you go. Would you like your screen share capacity?
Yeah, I would love to.
Let me just get you as a co-host. There you go. You now have the power and go for it. You have 5 minutes.
There you go. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Angel. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
There you go.
Angel has guardian name.
There you go. You good there? My name is Angel. I am a wildlife veterinarian. I collaborate with Australian Silver and Rescue Turtle. It's basically an organization that has been operating in the area for the last 30 years. It started basically one of the local fishermen in the area realized that there was a big impact on the seabird population in the area. He realized more than a third of the animals in the area that has some sort of injury related with the fishing gear. So he created this organization, and right now we are operating mostly with seabirds and sea turtles. We get more than 100 patients a year. Unfortunately, these numbers only show the animals that we are able to get access to, thanks to report and other volunteers that are helping us to collect them. But most of the time that's not possible because the animals may die of the injuries before we arrive. The mission and of the organization is to reduce the impact of marine life through rescue, rehabilitation, and education. I would like to show you some of animals that we treat and some of the main impacts that we have from recreation and commercial fishing in the area. Most of the ones that we see with lines are entanglements. Of course, they are not able to fly and to access any food source, so they will die with with lack of food and in a very slow death. And some of them they ingest the hooks and the tackle. So in those animals now, I will show some images, but the survival rate is really, really low, and it's really hard to access some of that gear. Other of the impacts that we can find also in the area is boat strikes, especially in areas where there's a high density of wildlife and a lot of fishing happening, and some other less related to fishing, but as we know, plastic pollution is affecting all our oceans. These are some of the images of some of the animals that we had week by week here in the rescue center. In the left side, we can see some of the hooks and discarded fishing gear that the turtles have access to. And basically, turtles, they have a system that they cannot vomit. So everything that enters only can go one way. They have a set of spikes in the throat and in the esophagus that doesn't allow them to vomit. So an animal that has swallowed some fishing gear, it will slowly lose the ability to eat by itself because the pain, and because also the intestines are gonna just like turn around and they make like knots in the intestines. And in the right side, we see some of the seabirds that we have accessed in the last few years. And as you can see, the hooks are a very aggressive and very invasive thing to have in the inside your body. So in the images that we can see there, these animals, not only they won't be able to access food, but also those hooks, they may pierce through vital organs and create internal bleeding and, of course, a very slow and painful death. Some of the other animals that we have in the center, through entanglement, basically those lines are gonna restrict the flow of blood to the limbs, which means that it could create necrosis, and it will basically, those animals, they will lose the limbs. They will need to be amputated, and some of the animals, unfortunately, won't be able to be released. Sometimes with the entanglements, we see that they have tendons or other structures that affect the flying capacity of the animals. So yeah, not even
6 minutes.
Yeah, not even an animal that we are to rescue, access, and use the remove the fishing gear, even though they won't be able to be released in the wild. In a positive note, we still live in a beautiful area where in this last season, 2021 and 2022, we got 5 nests of turtles that hatched, and we have more than 400 turtles going to the ocean. So it's definitely a beautiful area here, and yeah, we still have a lot of biodiversity. Unfortunately for the wildlife, the shoreline is probably the most dangerous place to allow fishing. It's we get a lot of calls and a lot of wildlife coming mostly from the shoreline here in the Barron Shire. So that's my presentation, short and sweet. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Given that it's Marine Parks Forum, I'm assuming your general comments about boat strikes and entanglements and that sort of thing have a little bit. Okay, so where are we now? Thank you very much, by the way. So we've got 2 more short presentations before lunch, which is obviously a little late, but that's okay. And the next one is by Alice Forrest, a marine biologist and tour guide who's very much on the front foot of the marine park work up north.
Can anyone hear me? I have no sound coming out of my...
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so Danielle asked me along today to talk a little bit about my proposal here in Byron to make this area a hope spot. So basically my background, I live here in the beautiful Northern Rivers of New South Wales in Bundjalung country. And we're really lucky here to have an incredible marine park off our shores that you've just heard a little bit about. And I spend a lot of time in the water here. I spend a lot of time under the water here. And I also work as a guide with a local whale watching company. So I'm very connected to the ocean here. I really love it. And I also work in a lot of places overseas as a wildlife guide, primarily Antarctica. So I've really seen firsthand how well it can work when stakeholders are involved, businesses are involved, and everyone cooperates to protect an area. And I think Antarctica is an incredible example of that. And I also am a marine biologist by training. So the science obviously is really important to me, and often it's very frustrating to see how much that's ignored. So with that in mind, several years ago, I saw the Mission Blue documentary with Sylvia Earle. And a few years ago, the thought came back and I learned more about hope spots. And so that's what I've proposed here in Byron. For anyone who doesn't know what a hope spot is, basically Dr. Sylvia Earle proposed this idea of a global network of sanctuaries that are the whole global community coming together to protect these special areas. So while it's not a government sanctuary, it still has hopefully a lot of value in bringing the community behind an area. So since Sylvia Earle proposed this idea, 143 hope spots have been launched, covering about 60 million kilometres, but obviously this falls well short of how much we need protected, which you've heard about from several speakers before, that 30% target at least. These hope spots have a range of goals. One of the main ones is basically improving existing marine sanctuaries. So we have this sanctuary in Byron, but as Dylan mentioned, it falls short in a lot of ways. And it is an incredible area. For anyone who's never been lucky enough to be in the water here in northern New South Wales, it's insane. There are so many incredible animals, so many threatened species, so much diversity. You get the mixing of the warm and cool waters. So it's a really, really special place and worthy of much better protection. Dylan talked a little bit about this. We have this marine park in place with some marine protection. However, it's quite small and not extremely representative. What I'm proposing with the Hope Spot is not a whole area of no-take zones, but it is just recognising that this stretch between the Brunswick River and the Richmond River is deserving of more and better protection and trying to get the community behind that goal. There's a lot of threats that occur even though we have this sanctuary or marine park classification. So for example, a few years ago in Ballina, the shark nets were put in. The protection of the marine sanctuary was taken away over the last few years and allowing more fishing in potentially areas that shouldn't have fishing. There's a lot of issues with runoff from the land. We have the Richmond River here, one of the most polluted rivers in New South Wales, pumping out into the marine park. And of course, the global issues like climate change. So there are so many things that make this area at risk, but that also gives us a lot of really cool opportunities to work towards better protection and to be a really good role model for the rest of the world, where currently we're definitely falling short. I think a few of the ways we need to improve on this is definitely better representation. A lot of the time in the marine sanctuary debate, you hear a lot of voices of some groups that are very overrepresented, where other groups maybe don't know how to get involved in the conversation. So for example, women, snorkelers, freedivers, I feel like there's a lot of groups that often don't get their voices heard. And other groups that get an unfair share of their say because they know how to manipulate the system better and can be louder. And so in the past, I feel like that's led us to not aim as high as we could. So we need to get more representation, more stakeholders involved, and also, of course, more representation of the different ecosystems like Dylan mentioned. So for me, this Hope Spot is a way to bring community support behind the sanctuary and keep pushing for more protection, keep aiming for 30 by 2030 or even more, and get these marine parks to a place where they really can actually do something to protect our oceans. So for me personally, this marine park is a really, really special place. But also as a scientist and a guide, I see how much value it has economically and for future generations. There are so many reasons it's deserving of our protection, and it's time we highlighted all those different voices that really care about this place and get them behind more protection and keep fighting for better protection. So bit of a nutshell talk here. I'd love to talk more with anyone who is interested in hearing more about it, but Keeping it short, this is a really important area. It has some protection, but it definitely needs more. There are so many different groups, from kayakers to surfers to swimmers, that use these areas. So let's all stand up, let's all raise our voices, let's create more hope, more optimism, but ultimately just more supporting the science, and get behind better protection and better sanctuaries. So that's my message for today. Let's listen to the communities and let's get better sanctuaries along our New South Wales coast, not marine parks, sanctuaries. Thanks.
Fantastic, Alice. Thanks for joining us. So we have a little bit behind, so we've got one more presentation before lunch. Liz Hawkins from Dolphin Research Australia. There you are. Oh, I said it before. Okay, you're doing it. Magic.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Liz Hawkins, CEO and founding director of marine conservation charity Dolphin Research.
Spin it off.
In the Cape Byron Marine Park in northern New South Wales. Bear with me while I share my screen quickly with you. We at Dolphin Research Australia, we're a grassroots marine conservation charity dedicated to ensuring the protection and conservation of marine life and our oceans through different research and monitoring programs, education programs, and action and advocacy work that we do. One of our projects is the Cape Byron Marine Park Dolphin Research Project, which began in 2003 as part of my PhD work at the time, and it now continues under Dolphin Research Australia. This work has involved identifying different species of cetaceans in the Cape Byron Marine Park and monitoring for the emergence of different viruses and diseases and different compliance issues in that space as well, with stranded and deceased animals. And a big part of our work has been looking at the population dynamics and understanding what this means for management and identifying areas of critical habitat for coastal cetaceans in the marine park as well. We've done a lot of work around tourism activities and the impact of tourism activities on cetaceans, both recreational and commercial activities in this space, measuring different levels of compliance, encounter rates, and establishing risk assessments for sustainable tourism in this area. Every aspect of the work that we have done and continue to do in the Byron region also involves citizen scientists and community volunteers. Much of the work that we do is actually voluntary, and we continue to fly the flag for these animals and the importance of this habitat for these animals to ensure that they are protected to the best of our ability. This animal here is an animal that we retrieved last year with the assistance of Arakwal Rangers and National Park Rangers. We did an assessment and we discovered a new, an emerging disease in this area which hadn't actually been detected in the species in Australia. This disease is called lobomycosis, and it is one that can be quite nasty for some animals and can result in the animals actually dying. So we are continually monitoring for things like that with the Marine Parks team and National Parks team. We have discovered that the Cape Byron Marine Park does provide critical habitat for resident population of Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins and also migrating humpback whales. This area of critical habitat is actually quite small, particularly for the bottlenose dolphins, and it also overlays areas of high levels of tourism activities. So we've worked, as I mentioned, alongside the Cape Byron Marine Park Authority to manage this space and apply adaptive management techniques. We've engaged stakeholder groups in applying different aspects of the management, and we've applied different special conditions to managing this space and the activities that are permitted in this space as well. We've also established education and training programs for cetacean tour and guide operations in the area to apply best practice approaches. And we continue to raise community awareness and engagement to encourage stewardship and really put out there that this marine park is extraordinarily valuable to these animals and that we should all be part of taking care of it. New South Wales marine parks do provide a great framework for the management and protection of marine mammals. And I would like to flag that the future of marine parks should also incorporate marine mammal protected areas, which would enable specific protections for critical habitat areas for species and populations of significant importance both ecologically, culturally, and economically. In the Cape Byron Marine Park, we present a case study for how effective this can be and how you can apply effective adaptive management for the protection of these animals. And by incorporating marine mammal protected areas into New South Wales Marine Park management, it also meets international best practice. We're really encouraged that this can be the future, and alongside sanctuary zones really provide a fantastic way of managing the interactions between human activities and also conserving and protecting these animals along our coastline, which are increasingly becoming threatened. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions or would like to know more about our work, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Liz. Much appreciated. So I think we should begin because we've got 3 more amazing marine park areas and marine regions to talk about. And so we are going to have a little session on the amazing, and I won't say, they've been around a while. Solitaries is probably the leader about 30 or so years ago. I hear Lemke's up at some point, who's a classic. And this is the part that really sets the scene for everything else. So,
well, coming from Denmark, where everybody is pretty close to the ocean, and the maritime industry is one of the largest industry in the country, it's natural for any young man to want to go to sea and see the world. What attracted me to settle from Europe in this country was that Australia is probably the most diverse and the most beautiful place on earth. Unfortunately, there's not everybody in the nation that feel that way. And understand that when you are fortunate enough to live in such a beautiful place, you also need to take stewardship of the place. So you need to consider that that place is more important than you, and you have to protect it to the best of your ability. That doesn't mean we can't live here and we can't make a living out of this place, but the first thing we need to consider in everything we do in life is what's good for the country. My actual involvement in Solitary Island was that I was asked if I would like to help out, and it became a bit of a passion for me. I went around to the universities and talked to the students in their breaks and got them to make a contribution in form of submission to the process. And we, over a period of 6 months, working almost every weekday, collected 3,500 submission for increased conservation in the marine park. From there on, we got approached by the 2 ministers that was in charge of it. There was the Minister for Fishery and the Minister for Environment in the government, in the ALP government, or the Labour Party government. And in general, they agreed that we should have a lot more conservation than than was proposed in the draft management plan, which at that time asked for 12%. Out of our discussion and our submission, a new draft plan was developed that come up with 20% in sanctuary zones, shy of the 33% we had asked for, but nevertheless a significant increase from the 8% of the marine park to the 20%. And the government agreed. It put it through the lower house in the New South Wales Parliament where it passed. It got into the upper house, passed there, went down for second readings in the Parliament, got past that second reading, went again up to the Legislative Council and was stalled by some members of that. And it was stalled so long, so a new election had to be called. And unfortunately, the Conservative got in and they scrapped the improvement we have been helping to achieve in the marine park. So we are now back to 12%, which is a long way away from what is necessary for us to maintain biodiversity. So the science associated with the marine environment is extremely important. But it is not necessarily the science that will create the conservation. It is normally activists, and everybody can be involved in this process.
If you scroll down, you just type in Mark and find it.
Ah, there he is there. Hi Mark, can you hear us?
I can, very clearly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, beautifully. I'm just going to try and find you on the list, which I might do this way so I can give you those sharing options.
I don't have slides or anything, I'll just be speaking.
Hand puppets and sock puppets, that's the best way, I agree. Okay, off you go.
I'm coming down the line to you from Gumbaynggirr country, and I pay the deepest respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'm speaking about the Solitary Islands Marine Park, which I also acknowledge covers Yaegl country to the north. The Solitary Islands Marine Park was the very first marine fully protected area in New South Wales. It's an area of certainly national significance for its marine and estuarine diversity, for the fact that it is an incredible mix of tropical and temperate biota. It contains some of the southernmost coral reefs, fringing coral reefs on Earth, really eclipsed only by Lord Howe. And sadly, big changes are afoot because the East Australian current is one of the world's fastest warming and accelerating conveyor belts for global heating. And it's highly likely that within the coming decades that a lot of the temperate biota that still exists within the Solitary Islands Marine Park will be forced out and southwards. And it is being noted by researchers and recreational users that shifts are occurring from the temperate to the tropical biota. I've had the good fortune and privilege of being involved in the SIMP since it was gazetted. And I've sat upon the Solitary Islands Marine Park Advisory Committee in a number of capacities. I've sat as a conservation representative, as a science rep, and for a 4-year period as a local government rep because I was an elected representative on Coffs Harbour City Council. And the Solitary Islands Marine Park is distinguished by having a series of very narrow coastal catchments to the north of Coffs Harbour. So the park begins basically at Coffs Harbour on the northern edge of the harbour itself. And going through to Urugir National Park are these very narrow coastal catchments. And of course, that's where there's been a massive amount of coastal sprawl. In my lifetime, the population of Coffs Harbour is about quadrupled or very close to quadrupled. And vast swathes of the landscape have been cleared and turned into industrial horticulture. Thankfully, to the north, with the Urrugia National Park and some of the very important terrestrial and estuarine habitats there that are within protected areas, there's been a limitation of pressures upon the marine environment. I've really enjoyed the roles that I played within SIMPAC because we've managed to find common ground about looking after the terrestrial environment and the estuarine environments across the broad spectrum of representative stakeholder interests within the SIMPAC. And it was recognised until the latest incarnation that, yeah, there was a need to unite for the benefit of the marine environment. Now, of course, we're at a critical juncture where humanity needs to desperately and in an emergency sense, protect 30% of our marine, our terrestrial, and our estuarine environments. And we need to do that by 2030 as an emergency response to the interwoven extinction and climate crises. I wasn't given a position on the current SIMPAC. My application on behalf of conservation interests was rejected by the Redneck National Party government. And basically we're facing a blitzkrieg upon our catchments and upon our diversity, largely driven by the ideology of the National Party, which has one of its greatest strongholds on the continent here on the North Coast. Our entire economy is underpinned by nature-based tourism, agriculture and fisheries. And if we don't look after our terrestrial environment, our estuarine environments and our marine environment, our entire economic base is eroded. And we're already seeing places such as Hearns Lake, which is a really critical icol within the marine park, basically becoming very close to a dead zone because of coastal sprawl and intensive horticulture, stealing the water in that catchment and poisoning it. So we've got a lot of work to do to ensure that the Solitary Island Marine Park is given a rosy future. And the first step to that is that we all need to agitate on every level to create 30% of the biosphere in this jurisdiction protected by 2030. That gives us the hope of dealing with the extinction crisis and averting the worst consequences of global heating. Thank you.
Ms. Logan, Mark, thank you very much. And yeah, that whole economic, it's a shame we've got a devolved economics, but it's an important thing for local communities. And yes, the degradation, even though there's wonderful areas, is a worry. All right, thanks for that. We'll now move on. Stay with us. And yes. Oh, there it is online anyway. Just Mark, you just start sharing your screen under here.
Sure.
Maybe, yeah.
How's that? All good? All good?
All good, yeah. I think the one is the computer will make Mike. There it is. Can you hear us okay, Mike?
Yes, yep, I can hear you fine.
Excellent, great. Well, looking forward to hearing from you. So you go ahead. Since it's short, I won't make a big elaborate introduction, but let's let you go for it.
Okay, yeah, well, my name's Mike Davey. I am the owner of Jetty Dive Centre. We've been operating this business for 25 years and virtually entered the business at the same time that the Solitary Islands Marine Park was started. Just briefly for us, the sanctuary zoning is very important. I think not only for the biodiversity that we've got at the marine park, but also for the preservation of a lot of species that are actually quite rare. I related the other night at another talk what we have seen personally through the time that we've been here. At the start of our business venture here, we were lucky to see a lot of marine life, including the smaller varieties like clownfish and anemones and the dories, which are a classic brought on by Finding Nemo. But now, because of the sanctuary zones that are in place, we're seeing them in abundance, which is really good to see. The point I'm making with that one is that these animals don't move very far, so they're quite common to see in the sanctuary zones that we dive. However, the animals that can venture out of the zones, which are rather small at the moment, they're the ones that are suffering. And the one that is most noticeable is the black cod. Around one of our islands, which is South Solitary Island, we have only a 100-metre sanctuary zone, and it's become very noticeable that that zoning is not big enough because of the amount of debris we're being seen by us in the zone, brought on by fishing. If it was bigger, it would protect these animals a lot more. We're seeing no improvement in these over the years. And I've been involved in supporting the research that the Marine Park do with videoing these to measure their size every year, and also record the numbers. And the numbers haven't improved over the last 10 years, which indicates that the zoning isn't really working for them. So the point I've got here is that, yes, we do need to increase the zone size in order to preserve these animals and the bigger animals that do have the ability to venture outside the zoning that's already there. That's the point I'd really want to make.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's good to get that also that long-term perspective from up there. So thank you very much. Sorry, we've got such short periods. We get speaker hours for each main speaker. Thank you.
Good on you. Thank you. All the best.
So I'm hoping Frank Future's out there in Zoom land is excellent, because let's find it first.
Dave, I'm going to go first. It's Ian Watt here.
I'm with Ian, Dave, so Ian kicks it off and then I'll follow up for the remainder, if that's okay.
Go for it, yes. I'm just trying to open up Zoom.
It's Ian Watt here, Vice President of the Marine Parks Association, Port Stephens, which we formed in 2014 to provide education and citizen science in support of our marine parks. If we want sustainable marine parks, we will need a paradigm shift in our approach to them, including the recently reviewed legislation, the Marine Estate Management Act of 2014. This act provides for the management of New South Wales marine parks as consistent with the principles of ecologically sustainable development goals, all very admirable aspirations. Ecologically sustainable development goals underpin the principles of marine parks, and in particularly sanctuary zones, which are recognized globally to be the most effective means of achieving the primary purpose of our marine parks: to conserve biological diversity and maintain ecosystem integrity. Yet discussions about sanctuary zones tend to have a myopic focus on fisheries, which in this context is largely irrelevant, though they can provide some insurance against potential fisheries management failure. Sanctuary zones have been shown to have significantly higher levels of biomass, diversity, and numbers and size of fish when compared to habitat protection zones, but that there is little difference between habitat protection zones and general use zones. Clearly, sanctuary zones are the only zones delivering on the legislation. In light of this, we have proposed that sanctuary zones in the Port Stephens Great Lakes Marine Park be increased to 30% of the area, a figure recognized as world best practice, rather than going for the lowest common denominator. The rest of the area, the habitat protection zone and the general use zones, can then be managed under standard fisheries management practice. To build towards this goal, we have proposed 3 new sanctuary zones for the area. The first of the ecologically sustainable development goals is the application of the precautionary principle. This aims to ensure that any proposed management action will not cause any further harm. The family-friendly version of this is the grandfather test. How will our grandchildren view our actions of today? Will they say you did a great job, or what were you thinking of? This is, of course, in reality, the intergenerational equity. What are we leaving for our kids and grandkids? Meanwhile, there is considerable community polarization over sanctuary zones, often based on political ideology and dogma. But this reflects valid deep-seated concerns about the right to fish against the need to conserve, often demonstrated in a fundamental belief in science matched by a fundamental distrust of science. But there is one thing we can all agree on. We'd all like to see more fish in the sea. We need to find some common ground beyond the politics and work towards a common goal. There are also the dynamics of shifting baselines and perceptions. Someone born in the 1980s was in their 20s in the early 2000s. But by the early 2000s, the marine environment was already in free fall. We had already witnessed massive fish stock crashes, algal blooms, and the first major global coral bleaching. Using the early 2000s as the baseline for assessing the current state of the marine environment is a very low bar. In this context, the perception that not much has really changed since 2000, so there isn't really much to worry about, or that the problems are being overstated by scientists, is easy to understand. Managing perceptions is complex, but important and needs to be addressed. Traditionally, marine conservation has always been the poor cousin to terrestrial conservation. It is expensive and difficult to manage. Most people only see the sea surface, but the changes happen under the water, out of sight, out of mind, and most people never see under the water, except perhaps on television, and that's all good news stories usually. And they certainly don't relate beach erosion, for example, to what is happening underwater. We need a massive public education program. Finally, the elephant in the room. There must have been some serious horse trading when the Marine Estate Management Act was drafted. To have DPI fisheries and extractive agencies share responsibility for marine parks, a conservation agency, is an absolute anathema and essentially puts the fox in charge of the henhouse. It is entirely inappropriate. I cannot imagine the national parks and their old growth timber being managed under DPI forestry. There would be an uproar. Using this metric, why would marine parks be managed under DPI fisheries? If we want to see a sustainable future for marine parks in New South Wales, it is critical that we decouple, that they be decoupled from DPI fisheries. They should be an independent body with a statutory budget and staff, much the same as National Parks and Wildlife Service. After all, marine parks are as important as our national parks and should be recognised as such. So now I'm going to hand you over to Frank by just twisting the laptop like that. And there's Frank.
Hi, guys. Well, I think Ian sort of highlighted the key issues there. I'm Frank Future. I've been a tour operator in Port Stephens, Great Lakes Marine Park, and for 27 years. I was on the original advisory committee, and I know that the sanctuary zones were hard fought. It was not an easy thing, but we got a good agreement. I know many recreational fishers, the more extreme vocal elements of them, have said that many of the sanctuary zones, or all of the sanctuary zones, were not contrived. They call it fake science. But I know there was a lot of science involved in some of the big ones with grey nurse, and in the middle of Port Stephens, the biggest sanctuary zone was certainly helped with Macquarie University, some huge studies we helped contribute to protect the dolphins in shallow areas where there's lots of fish, and security from sharks attacking from deep water. So we managed to get a really large sanctuary zone, but I do admit that many of the smaller zones were areas least used by recreational fishermen, so they were less controversial. So that is now being held against the remake of all of the marine parks, that some of those sanctuary zones indeed weren't scientifically contrived. But we did think that over the time, a huge budget would help marine parks actually bring more science into them. But I have to say that both Max Hayes, the original manager of this marine park, and Luke Erskine, an outgoing manager, had said the budget was absolutely minuscule for science, and they relied heavily on universities contributing with students coming up. So it was a shame that it was sidelined. And you can see that politically, that's what happened. When the marine park was formed, the minister at the time under Bob Carr, have mandated no more than 20% sanctuary zones. We wound up with 17% in our marine park, and I know that was probably bigger than some of the other marine parks, but it is time to shoot for 30%. That's got to be the way we've got to go. So it's obviously going to be a political issue, but we've got to stand together. And I know I've got lots of fishing mates, even though I'm in ecotourism. I've seen, since the marine park established 14 years ago, an area that we've been snorkeling on for 27 years, it went into an urchin barren, and it's now started to come back as a result of some protections around this particular island. And I've witnessed that over 27 years with my own eyes, the recovery of kelp and all the other critters that come with it, including turtles, we now see as well. So it's not, if a sanctuary zone is large enough, in the right spot, and people comply with it, then there's no doubt that they will benefit everything down the track. But we certainly have to shoot for that 30% and make it it's going to be a political issue anyway, but we've got to go for that, because all the other management practices that we've been offered are really not going to make much difference. It's all about sanctuaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank and Ian. And I should say I was for about a year or so on that committee back 14 years ago. Frank was on, he was a great member. I also remember Minister McDonald saying, you'll have no more than 19% on my watch. And I also remember the areas being zoned and carved up with at least half the members of the committee fishing interests. We were really good and knowledgeable, but certainly a lot of the decisions were not made based on nature, they were based on not so good fishing spot, which of course later on means when you come to assess the value of these sanctuary zones, they don't shape up too well, some of them, because they were peripheral leftover areas. So yeah, all interesting. All right, thanks guys, appreciate it.
Yeah.
So moving with the dizzying pace on the different marine parks, we've got a bit of some vignettes on Jarvis Bay Marine Park now, and hopefully Jeremy Day's back there. Oh, there. It's good, very good. Can you hear us okay?
It's on our end.
Hey guys, my name is Jez Day, and I'm going to talk to you about snapper and the general benefits of marine sanctuary zones. I'm going to focus on the Jervis Bay Marine Park because that's somewhere my work has taken me a lot over the past few years, and I'm going to focus on some other popular nearshore species, not just snapper, which are relevant to my work. A bit about me, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle, where I work on the feeding ecology of sea urchin predators and food web dynamics of urchin barrens habitats. So marine sanctuaries are really important because they provide best chance estimates of what predator densities might look like in the absence of fishing pressure. And this is really important because people love to fish for things like lobsters and large fish. Hence, it's really difficult to say what these communities might look like if we stopped fishing now or in pre-colonial times. So sanctuary zones provide a best chance estimate of that. So another really valuable snapshot that sanctuaries can provide to ecologists is of what habitats might look like in a situation where you have elevated or restored predator density. And in terms of my own work, it's worth noting that these areas can take a really, really long time to see effects of sanctuary zone protection, or I should say the expected effects, but these effects can also occur rapidly. One thing they've been really good for is the pink snapper fishery, Crossophorus auratus. So these guys have been overexploited historically. They've shown a marked recovery in Jervis Bay sanctuary zones. And this is largely because they show a general home range, but they also move around. So they move around seasonally and they move in between estuaries and offshore. But creating sanctuaries can be a really effective way of rapidly increasing the density. So a recent study shown that you can get plus 6 times the snapper density in a fished area if you make it into a sanctuary. But of course, this scales with productivity. So if you do this in a really high productivity area, you might get that kind of result, whereas in a lower productivity ecosystem, it might take a bit longer. But it's important to note that it appears for snapper specifically, wherever you put the sanctuary is a net positive. Another fish that I work on a lot is the blue groper, Acoeridus viridis. It's also been overexploited historically, now really common on headlands all over New South Wales. And these guys show really strong side attachment. So different to the snapper, which do show a home range but move around a lot, these guys are effectively conserved even by really small sanctuary zones. So that's great news, and it just goes to show the different values that different species can get out of sanctuaries. And this brings me to the lobsters, the eastern rock lobsters, Sagittarius varroa. So this is the main critter that I've been working on. They've been overexploited historically and similarly show a really marked recovery. And we expect that this has been helped by sanctuary zones. However, they're notoriously difficult to census. And this is because they can be resident. Here's a big lobster living in a Jervis Bay sanctuary zone, but they can also migrate over 1,000 k's seasonally, so they can be hard to count as adults. Just anecdotally, to the side, I did a acoustic tagging study in 2019 on these guys, and we found consistently larger lobsters inside the sanctuary and just on the outskirts. So while it's not recorded for the eastern rock lobster, many other lobster species are shown to spill over from sanctuaries into adjacent fished areas, and I'd be really unsurprised to hear that also happens with the easterns, but they're difficult to count. So what is the value of a sanctuary? Well, I hope you can see from the very brief case studies I've shown you here that they provide long-term protection for residents, but they also provide intermittent protection for transitory species and species that migrate, and that can be just as important. Overall, only 6% of the New South Wales coastline is sanctuary zone. Does it not make sense to at least keep some area where we don't take fish out of the ocean? It seems pretty straightforward, but there's been a lot of pressures and a lot of pushes to get into these areas and fish them. And just on that, I just want to leave you with the idea that regardless of the community assemblage you see there, opening sanctuaries to any kind of fishing pressure will jeopardize long-term data sets. And it's like upsetting a really long-term Petri dish that's really important contemporary baseline data. And that includes removing sea urchins from sanctuaries. So these are really things that many of us don't want to see happen, myself included. And I hope that my talk has brought some of those issues to light in a different way, maybe. Thanks very much. And if you want to follow my work, you can follow the social media links. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, Jervis Bay, or Jarvis as I call it, there's a fantastic area in general. I did my first dives there in February 1978, and there were lots of sculpts around green patch which have long gone. So even in that short time, there's been huge changes down there. All right. Oh, there's Scott's. You guys are good. Scott, do you read? Can you hear us?
Another video.
Another video? Oh, it's a video.
Hi, I'm Scott Sheehan from Marine Mammal Research, Jervis Bay. For the past 22 years, we have collected data on resident dolphins and migrating whales. We're very lucky here in Jervis Bay Marine Park, having 2 seal and a penguin colony, resident and offshore dolphins, humpback whale, southern right, and killer whale migrating north and south. Our research has shown the marine park is a critical habitat for resident bottlenose dolphins as a nursery and a resting site for southbound migrating humpback whales, mother and calves. What are the current threats to the marine mammals of Jervis Bay? 2 key issues show a negative impact to the resident and visiting marine mammals. Number 1, harassment. An increase in vessel, personal watercraft, jet ski, and thrill seekers swimming with marine mammals. This is disturbing, changing their natural course of direction and behaviour. Number 2, noise pollution, an increase of anthropogenic noise from vessel, aircraft, day and night all year round. This is disturbing and changes their behaviour, moving them out of a safe habitat. So what is a marine park? This statement is from Parks Australia government site. Marine parks help conserve marine habitats and the marine species that live within and rely on these habitats. So conservation is the key. That is the backbone to establishing and keeping and maintaining a marine park. A marine park is more than just a sign at the entrance of the town. It's a community and its values. The Jervis Bay Marine Park was established in 1988 and its zones and management rules commenced in October 2002 with a key document formed the foundation 19 years ago, the operational plan for Jervis Bay Marine Park, October 2003. But Jervis Bay has a complicated management of government bodies. Locally, the Shoalhaven City Council, New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Services, Environment Australia to the north at Beecroft Peninsula, Buddery National Park to the south at Barreri Peninsula, Department of Defence, which is the Navy at Creswell in the south within the Buddery National Park, and obviously Jervis Bay Marine Park and Department of Primary Industries. And also to complicate it a little bit more, we have New South Wales Maritime, New South Wales and Federal Police, as the Commonwealth Waters is ACT. So now for 2022, a new draft New South Wales Mainland Marine Parks Network Management Plan for 2022 to 2032 should be coming out this year. Yes, times have changed and some aspects of the marine park need to be updated. Some have evolved naturally, but the core values should not have changed. The concerns are that marine parks' efforts are being wound back and dismantled as they have been under a new umbrella of governance for some time now. Ever since the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, DPI, have taken control, they have shown a difference in value and agenda to the original ideas of what a marine park should be, with the new management plan solely drafted by DPI on behalf of the Marine Estate Management Authorisation. So key indicators should be for a marine park to assess new actions, zones or permits. Number 1, does this show conservation value? Number 2, is there compliance and monitoring involved? Over the past 4 years under DPI control, we have seen the marine parks acting managers change more than 7 times, and the management have overwritten and not followed their own guidelines set in place to change these rules to suit their own agenda. The concerns are, if this is happening within our marine mammal issues, what other actions and zones or permits are DPI management not following? There are many concerns from stakeholders within all New South Wales marine parks. If there is no conservation value and no compliance, then it's a no-go towards protecting the marine park's assets and foundation. Thank you for listening. Support Marine Mammal Research Jervis Bay and citizen science for a better marine park.
Thanks very much for that. So we have so either Sue Newson, is she online? She's there.
I'm here.
Yes, good afternoon. Please speak, Sue. Good to see you.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank Danielle and James for inviting me to speak at this forum and to share my views. My name is Sue Newson, and I've been living in Jervis Bay for 30 years. For the past 15 years, I've been operating my own dive business called Crest Diving. Apart from teaching people how to scuba dive, I predominantly provide personal guided snorkeling and scuba diving tours in the Jervis Bay Marine Park, as well as the waters of Booderee National Park. And these are for people from all around the world, from beginners to experience. Basically, I live, work and play in the Jervis Bay Marine Park area. My personal motto is that it's all about the fish, but really it's all about the marine life as a whole. My love of the marine life of Jervis Bay started almost 24 years ago, from the very first time I put my face in the water when I learnt to snorkel here. It was truly a wow moment that changed my life, and I've had many wow moments since then. Anything here is possible to see in Jervis Bay. There's so much more to the marine life here than the whales, dolphins, seals, sharks, or even any highly sought after fisheries target species. We really do have it all, but so much of it is overlooked or undervalued. Over the years, I've assisted various researchers with their projects, and I also participate with Reef Life Survey team, helping to survey the marine life here in Jervis Bay. I've even starred in a number of documentaries about the marine life here in Jervis Bay, most notably the Port Jackson shark. So from the very beginning, I felt it was important to know what I was looking at and also be able to identify it. For many years now, every time I snorkel or scuba dive, I record everything I see, and the data is stored in my logbooks, and it's readily available for any researchers or anyone else who might find some value from it. It's from this data that I've been able to recognise some of the more subtle changes that have occurred over the years here. I've spent many hundreds of hours underwater observing the marine life, but it is still only just a drop in the ocean. It's just a mere glimpse of what happens under there. It takes years to confirm what I think I'm seeing is actually what I am seeing. Overall, we know very little about the marine environment, and the general information is severely lacking, as most species research in the past has been based on its importance within a fishery rather than species protection or its ecological importance. But that is changing, especially with the aid of citizen science. When I first started diving, the Jervis Bay Marine Park was still in its planning stages. I knew very little about what that even meant, because I also knew very little about the marine life. As time went by, my knowledge of the Jervis Bay marine environment grew, and my understanding of the importance of the sanctuary zones grew with it. Gradually, over the years, I have seen firsthand the positive changes that are occurring in these zones. The most common comment I get from visitors and clients relates to why fishing is allowed in the marine park. Of course, I explain about the park being multi-use with different zones for the different activities people do. I do wonder why some activities are being permitted, as they are often interfere with other users, or it undermines the conservation objectives of the marine park. These include activities such as the use of jet skis, some fishing practices, and more recently, the swim with whale tours. Key threats to the marine environment have been identified, but it feels like a bare minimum is being done to address them. Compliance is a significant and ongoing issue, yet checks are few and far between. I truly believe that time, compliance, and consistency is what's needed for the habitats to regenerate. Without protecting the habitat, the marine life will continue to be under threat. Increasing the sanctuary zones in accordance with scientific recommendations should be a priority in all the marine parks, and in doing so, we also need to increase public awareness of the marine environment through carefully planned information programs. It's extremely important that the correct information is provided to avoid confusion about perceived threats, like the current topic relating to the Cetrostephanus rogersii urchin barrens. All those years ago, when I first saw the underwater world, I would not have believed that more than 2 decades later, we would still need to defend the importance of conserving and protecting the marine environment. And that's my views. Thank you.
It's so important to hear those the experiences of people who've been looking for decades. So thank you for sharing that with us. Do we have any?
Yep, she's ready to go.
Oh, there she is. Can you hear us okay, Penny?
Hi there. I do have some slides.
All right, so we can find you and
If I'm
just give us a second and start talking if you want. Otherwise, I'll just keep looking for you. There you are.
Here I am.
Make you a co-host, if that's all right. Then you'll be able to share your screen if you want to. All right, you should be co-host.
Okay. Well, look, I actually have to admit that I don't know how to do it. Oh, look, you've got all sorts of things there.
Oh, you do. You do know how to do it.
You can see all my passwords.
We've put this in numbers.
Has that worked? Let me
Yeah.
see. Yeah. Okay. So, and you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Firstly, I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land on which we're on. I'm speaking on behalf of a coalition of community groups called the Jervis Bay Community Cruise Ship Coalition. We came together because we were and are worried about the proposal to make Jervis Bay a permanent cruise ship port. By that, I mean that cruise ships would no longer need to seek permission to enter Jervis Bay because permission would be permanently granted in the Marine Park Management Plan. We are a combined community that believes Jervis Bay is a precious natural area. We live in various parts of the Shoalhaven and outside. We swim, dive, snorkel, fish, kayak, dolphin watch, whale watch, sail, boat, walk around Jervis Bay. We are a mixed group of people that care, and we have found like concern from visitors and businesses. We are people who are not usually inclined to campaign, but on Jervis Bay, this community was unwilling to stay silent. An early start for us was a very well-attended film night raising concerns about proposed changes to marine parks. We've since had information tables at village hubs with a petition. We've set up social media, have done radio and newspaper interviews, developed close links with existing groups such as Keep Jervis Bay Unspoilt, lobbied and met with politicians. We are concerned that permanently turning Jervis Bay into a cruise ship port will have negative consequences on the marine environment, but also on our current tourism and on the overall social and cultural values and ambience of Jervis Bay. There would be very few places in Jervis Bay where a cruise ship could hide or not be seen. When we got together, we tried very hard to collect accurate information about what was being proposed, where, when, how would the cruise ship port be established. We wanted to know about any environmental studies that had been done and about research that had been done on cruise ships elsewhere. The effort to gather information left us with additional concerns around lack of transparency and overt silencing of government agencies, failure to engage in meaningful community consultation and discussions, and a perception of a failure on the state's part to actually care about Jervis Bay. Letters from the Port Authority, who we had written to, said that there were no current plans to use Jervis Bay as a cruise ship port. They wrote this all the while that 5 cruise ship itineraries, which included Jervis Bay, were being sold. We could not get information from anyone, Marine Park Advisory Committees, ministers, Port Authority, local council. So we took to the streets with a paper parliamentary petition and got media attention. We started reading as many research papers as we could. The parliamentary petition has nearly 7,000 signatures, residents and visitors, business owners, and given the slow pace of the preparation of the management plan, we are continuing to collect signatures. Our petition states the proposed and planned presence of cruise ships in Jervis Bay Marine Park is not consistent with the primary purpose of marine parks or serves any of the objectives of the management plan itself. The petition has 5 specific requests to the state, including increase no-take sanctuary zones to 30% of the Jervis Bay Marine Park, consistent with current scientific recommendations. The research clearly indicated to us that one of the surest ways to protect the whole of Jervis Bay ecosystem is to ensure we have adequate sanctuary zones. We are also concerned, especially given the tenor of the draft management plan, that permanent approval for cruise ships will expand to bigger ships, more ships, and a renewed call for a marina or harbour in Jervis Bay. We are worried about the future, but we are also concerned about the level of current resourcing and worried that increased use and development without adequate resourcing to ensure compliance and adequate strategic plans that focus on sustainability will mean the loss of many environmental, social, and economic values. The community, its visitors, and many businesses want Jervis Bay to be just as pristine in 100 years' time as it is now, or better. We want the bay to be strongly protected, equal to the best marine parks in the world, so that our recreation and commercial activities can continue. We will continue to talk and lobby politicians to share any information we have with the community and build our network. We do not intend to be silent. Thank you.
Well said, Penny. Jervis Bay has been had a record of citizen power. I mean, way back when you were supposed to have a nuclear power plant, and the East Coast Navy was going to relocate there. So keep up the good work, and hopefully this will be another storm in a teacup. Okay, right. So moving on to our final part, Bateman's part. And I'm hoping to have Bill Barker online. Bill is a great advocate and orator and brief life surveyor in the past or future. I don't know. How are you, Bill?
I'm good, thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, yeah. Go for it.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm on Ewan land here, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to traditional owners. Most of the important decisions about marine parks are political ones, whether to have marine parks, where they'll be, the level of protection, and the allocation of resources. The March 2023 state election will be crucial for the future of marine parks in New South Wales, with long unfinished business yet to be resolved by the current government and the possibility of a new approach from the alternative. It's important to appreciate that a political decision is more than just a decision made by a politician. Political decisions at their best manage to merge the competing interests of various groups in proposals that serve the greatest possible good. A characteristic of the competing interests around marine parks is the contrast between a broad but shallow level of support for marine conservation among the general community and an intense level of both support and opposition among different specialists. This tends to skew the focus onto the minority voices. Marine park decision-making over the past 10 years or so in New South Wales has been poor, the clearest evidence for which is widespread dissatisfaction with the process. There's a strong sense that decisions haven't been satisfactorily blended into the various interests, and that in fact they favoured minority voices in the community. It wasn't always like this. Once there was bipartisan consensus across the political spectrum. 30 years ago, federal and state governments committed to a national system of marine protected areas. In 1998, the Howard government adopted Australia's oceans policy. In 2003, it increased sanctuary zone protection in the Barrier Reef Marine Park from less than 5% to over 33%. In New South Wales, a Liberal national government established the Solitary Islands Marine Reserve in 1991. A state Labor government passed the Marine Parks Act in 1997 with bipartisan support. Environment Minister Bob Debus had a significant role as a committed and consistent leader of the process. So where did things go off the rails? First, there's the political cycle. Governments are born, they flourish for a while, decay, and then finally fall. In New South Wales, the Labor government that established most of our marine parks was in decline by 2007. Some in the Liberal and National opposition at the time smelt blood in the water and intensely pursued a cynical approach based on whipping up support among potential anti-marine park voters in coastal seats. Any thoughts of consensus, the general good, or the wishes of the broader community were thrown out of the window. And something similar happened at the federal level. Second, political consensus doesn't usually come from nowhere. Often it has to be based on community consensus, which may have to be fostered through a conscious and facilitative process of bringing different stakeholders together. Now, it can actually be easier to appreciate one another's knowledge, commitment, and constraints when in a face-to-face situation. And on the basis of mutual respect, people can explain their different points of view and negotiate compromises. With a bit of guidance and give and take, positive outcomes can be achieved to the benefit of all. And Dane Wilmot's going to talk about a process like this in abatements in just a moment. Governments need to provide expert facilitation, but they also need to provide leadership, good faith consultation, as well as willingness to share power and to change direction in response to criticism. When the coalition came into power in New South Wales in 2010, they more or less stopped talking about marine parks. Early on, they set in motion a Frankenstein's monster in the form of the marine estate management process, and its 11-year-old review grinds on. In the meantime, they've run down marine parks to the point where they have little visibility, diminished resources, few staff, and limited programs for research, education, compliance, or community outreach. Those who value marine parks struggle against ad hoc attacks from the government while living in apprehension of what further damage might be done. And Jane will talk about what's happening in abatements over recent years. Now, time constraints prevent me from addressing in detail the implications of this analysis, but the current state government is in the declining phase of the political cycle and will probably lose office next year, though nothing's certain in politics. Contacts with current ministers should encourage them to articulate positive leadership around marine parks, to return to a consensus approach, and to set up genuine community consultation. The appearance of environment ministers who at least accept the science behind marine parks is a positive thing. It's equally important to ensure that the alternative government comes in with a full understanding of the issues, good attitudes, and good policies for managing the way forward. Adequate resourcing is crucial for marine parks to flourish. And beyond that, we as conservationists also need to reach out in good faith and in a spirit of compromise to other stakeholders in our communities. Thank you very much.
Wise words and fascinating political insights. The rise and fall and decay of governments. Thanks again. So our next speaker, yes, unfortunately, wish we had more time for all of these, is Dr. Jane Ellick, who's the president of the Nature Coast Marine Group. So Jane will find you. Yes, yes. I'm just gonna. Do you need to be co-host, Jane?
You mean screen sharing?
Yeah.
I just got a slide, but it's not really important if you don't want to do it.
Easy to do, but speak from the heart, if you like, instead.
I'm just going to speak. I've just got a slide I could show at the end. Okay.
I'll put you as co-host in case you want to take the risk of being a slide shower. There you go. You're in. So you can share screen with your slide if you like. Otherwise, just speak.
Okay. Can people see me or not?
No.
Or hear me?
Just speak, Jay.
We can hear you, Jane.
Yeah. Well. Okay. That better? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Yeah, we've had 4 speakers from the Nature Coast Marine Group. I'll just quickly say that we're a local community group, a fairly key community group that basically our main aim is to support the Batemans Marine Park in both education and advocacy aspects. And we've got sort of over 200 paying members and 700 supporters, so we're quite a key group. So today I'm talking about the evils of amnesties, the continuing battle to overturn 6 fishing amnesties in Batemans Marine Park sanctuaries. So the declaration of amnesties to allow fishing in no-take sanctuary zones by ministers is an example of the current marine park decision-making process that Bill has just talked about, not getting broad support for greater good, but pandering to a small subset of stakeholders and not following the science. It's also a symptom of the marine parks being run by the Department of Fisheries as a fisheries tool rather than by the Department of Environment, which a few people have touched on. The current New South Wales government has a history of amnesties being declared in sanctuaries followed by public outcry, with some but not all being revoked, resulting in a loss of value and a steady whittling away of protected areas, a bit like one of the speaker just now saying, and a real loss of long-term databases when they declare amnesties. For example, in 2013, 30 amnesties were declared on beaches and headlands within the sanctuary zones, in allowing fishing from the shoreline in 4 of the New South Wales marine parks. 18 months later, after a large public outcry, 20 of them were restored to full sanctuary status, but only 3 of the 7 were restored in Bateman's area. The current amnesties that was declared in 6 sanctuaries in Bateman's Marine Park were declared in December 2019. Fisheries Minister Marshall and our own local minister, the Minister for Transport, Andrew Constance, in the company of several local fishers. This was blatant pandering to the local fishing community. There was no prior consultation with scientists or even the local or any marine park staff. All 6 of these amnesties are in the Narooma area, 4 in shallow seagrass areas of inlands and lakes where the fishermen like to fish, and 2 are around Montague Island, which is known as an aggregation area for grey nurse sharks, as well as being green listed for its land conservation values, such as seabird nesting and the seal haulouts. And Minister Constance promised to fast track the consultations. So the whole marine conservation community was alarmed, since both ministers were recorded in meetings with fishing clubs, saying that these were the low-hanging fruit, and more sanctuaries in New South Wales would be opened up to fisheries very shortly. So Nature Coast Marine Group, with the advice and assistance from other conservation groups such as AMCS, NPA, the Pew Trust, the Shark Champions, and an independent politician, immediately swung into action, mobilising community support for a Save Bateman Sanctuary campaign and in preparation for the consultation period to open. We sent numerous letters to ministers. Environmental Minister Keen's answer was whether he would restore the sanctuary was yes, and he would come down and have a dive on Montague Island, but we're still waiting. Numerous phone calls and requests for meetings of our local member Constance went unanswered. We learnt later that he'd blocked our email address. An online petition has gathered over 3,500 signatures, and we've had more paper signatures from around the community, including quite a lot of business community supports, especially the tourism industry that we've heard from a bit today. We had several hundred postcards signed from stalled in local markets, but we're still waiting to send them in because the consultation period hasn't opened yet. We set up a Save Bateman Sanctuary website and social pages so that we could send electronic letters. We commissioned the making of a short documentary film, Sanctuary, in which prominent people, including the local Indigenous community, were interviewed to express their support for sanctuaries. It was launched at a community event in Narooma and is actually available for everyone to view on our website, which I can write in the chat after this. We had numerous articles published in the local state media, but our biggest and most successful event was our paddle out that we organised in Narooma in November 2020, almost a year after sanctuaries, the amnesties were declared. So in spite of COVID...
Sorry, again, it's probably about time to
Right.
finish, but yeah, some wonderful things there. I know all about that paddle out, and yeah, you've done a wonderful job down there.
Okay, well, just
sorry,
say...
we just enjoyed it behind the schedule a little bit, but that's very important.
Okay, all right, so main thing I just want to say, yeah, we had 300 people attending, and we feel we did have some success because we at least no more sanctuary zones were declared, no more amnesties were declared, and now we're waiting for the general review. And so the main thing is that politicians do take notice of the community, but that's sadly at the cost of the regard to science. So really support that idea of veto for scientists having a veto power sounds fantastic. Bring it on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Yes, and I can tell you amnesties are very demoralising to scientists and to everybody, but particularly scientists who just it flies in the face of anything without it. All right, so Danielle, there's a couple of red X's here, which I guess I'm kind of hoping means they're not presenting.
I don't know if the next one gains here, it means they're here.
Sorry?
Yeah,
so you're one of the red X's. We're way behind schedule because everyone has some important things to say in 5 minutes is not enough. So yes, the more we can get to our points, the better, I guess you might say. Just stop sharing. We say that for 26. Oh, there we go. So where is she on? Everyone's here that's on that list. So we have an issue with timing, so we're just going to have to deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Ryan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. My name is Danny Wilmot. I live in Narooma on the South Coast. As you can tell from my last two speakers, Jane and Bill, we're pretty much less than impressed with the politicians of the state and the decisions around sanctuary zones. Specifically, I'm here to talk today about urchin barracks. These guys. So just a quick one on myself. I'm not a scientist, I'm a firefighter, and I work for Fire Rescue New South Wales. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Illawarra, in Town Oxford, little sort of place, bit like the Shire and Oxford. Yeah, chasing everything that moved, catching everything that moved. So yeah, when it comes to fishing, I am a fisherman, I'm a speed fisherman, and I've caught just about everything from a bream to a blue marlin. But with that said, I'm a strong advocate for marine parks. I firmly believe that we need 30% or more if we're to make a difference. So, urchin barracks. Started at Narooma, it's a big issue down there. Okay, it took me on this journey and to discover that this is actually not just a South Coast thing or a Tasmanian thing, it's worldwide. So this photo is taken in the Mediterranean. Next shot I have is one in Japan. Now, an urchin barrack can be described as what we pretty much see here, okay, largely devoid of biodiversity, moonscape-like appearance, okay, very little macro and micro algae, okay. And this one was taken in a sanctuary zone at Montague Island. So yeah, you can see what we're talking about. Now, off the back of images like this, brought together up to 100 people at a symposium that was held in Narooma last year, and it covered a broad range of stakeholders. At this symposium, we had everyone from Indigenous fishers to commercial abalone, merchant fishers, conservationists, dive groups, you name it, they were there. Okay, DBI was there too. Fantastic. So we're going to go on a little bit of a journey around the world here, because like I said, it took me on one. So moving here we go again, California, same thing. Okay, it's taken, I believe, somewhere off the California coast around Monterey Bay, and I'll come back to this. Now, I want to make it clear that these guys, okay, they're a natural part of the environment, okay, they're key, okay, they're food for a lot of species, okay, they also provide habitat for things like juvenile abalone. So it's a case of we can't shoot the messenger. It might seem clear, oh, we need to cull these numbers. And I remember as a boy diving, seeing these things around the Shell Harbour, I didn't understand them well at all. But it's had this deep sense that this isn't right. You know, this doesn't look good, and it doesn't look good. So we go on this journey and suddenly, whoa, hang on a minute, we're in Yellowstone National Park. Now, why am I there? Now, in the late 1800s, wolves were declared public enemy #1. They were taken out, okay? And after a strong advocacy for their reinstatement in around 1995, got brought back in. And what happened? Bigger populations turned up. Why? Wolves kept elk numbers in check. Elk were overgrazing aspen. The beavers needed the aspen. Okay, similarly. Hang on a minute, we're in Africa. Same thing. Land has been degraded in Africa, and particularly the work by men and Alan Sager, if you want to get into that wormhole, is an interesting one, and soil health. Now, Alan Sager did work to identify what was causing the degradation of grasslands in Africa. And they came to the conclusion, this man very passionate about his health of his land, and they came to the conclusion at one point, we need to cull elephants. Now, this is a man who's a conservationist. Made the hard decision to cull 40,000 elephants. And you know what? Didn't make a difference. So they went back to the drawing board, and they went right back to figure out, okay, well, it wasn't always like this. What's happened? And they brought it back to when the big white hunter went in there and started shooting these guys. What happened then? We have a trophic cascade collapse, similar to the urchins, similar to the beavers. So it's a very exciting area, like I said, if you want to go down, because it's starting to mimic the roles that these apex predators play by keeping herds tight and moving around fast. We're able to increase soil health, which increases the health of the land overall. So we're back in the room. This symposium took place. Great way to say it. A steering committee was formed off the back of this, which has been done work. And these are some of the people that are on this steering committee. And like I said, it's a big achievement, I would say, is when it's been able to keep all these stakeholders that came together to form a program, that I got a picture of, to put forward a strategy, okay, how we're going to deal with this. So one of the ideas that's come out of this, and I'm very grateful to be here, particularly the work with Jeremy Day, which I will be in touch with Newcastle University, is that perhaps we can play the role of that apex predator by doing some active intervention in certain ways. And there are programs currently in place that are doing this to act in the role of those large lobsters in particular, snapper, which we haven't kind of identified, but I'm grateful to hear Jeremy really is doing work in there, and large blue broker. These are the apex predators that keep these numbers in check, which keep our reef overall healthy. Okay. However, I need to finish on one final thing. Okay, so being identified by other speakers, the heating up of the East Coast current is a very key factor in this. Some of the early trials we've done to the Abalone Association, where we've done culling and stuff to reduce numbers down, have seen as a result of these more intense frequent storms annihilate all reef, including the urchins. So we need to tread very carefully in this space about what programs we implement, because we may even possibly tip an imbalance the other way and take the food source out for these large predators, the broker, the snapper, the large lobsters. So thank you for your time. Watch this space. There's a lot of energy going in towards it. DPI is finally starting to throw some money towards this. However, it's a big issue because it's been identified here up to 50% of our coastline on the south coast is affected by this phenomenon. So this underpins, they talk money, they talk about fisheries, high value fisheries. It's all underpinned by our Ecolonia radiata kelp, all the micro and macro algae, and that is directly related to fisheries.
Thanks very much, Dan. Yeah, really, it's a bit of a controversial topic that could use fishing input as well at some point, from another point of view. Red X is notwithstanding. So, do we have James Caffrey out there? See, oh, you are there, yes. Okay. Do you need to share your screen?
I would love to, yes.
Okay. Where are we? Pop up there. You don't pop up there. What's going on?
It dips.
There's no R. Try that.
Let's try James.
Yeah, James. Typing out the ancient old PC keyboard today. There we go. 5 minutes. Go for it. You should have it fast. Cheers.
Let me just get my thing up. Alrighty. So yeah, my name's James Caffrey. I'm here to talk to you about a really positive oyster reef restoration project that is happening down here on Yuin country. I'm in Potato Point right now, And I'm from Alice Springs originally and lived in Canberra a while. I was deprived of the ocean for a very long time, but then in my gap year, I went to Exmouth and just fell for it, fell hard, and decided to study, went up to Townsville and that in JCU. And then I've now come down to the South Coast of New South Wales and I've been networking, I've been doing lots of volunteering, and I've managed to weave my way into the Nature Coast Marine Group and a few others and become a part of this project, which I'm really excited for. It's a really important one because some of you may and some of you may not know, we've lost about 99% of the functionality of our oyster reefs in Australia, especially that of the Angazi flat oysters. There is only one reef that is still functioning and is still providing its ecosystem services in the whole of Australia. Only one reef, and that one's in Tasmania. So this is, due to overharvesting. They just get absolutely smashed. Water pollution, disease, habitat destruction. There's a whole myriad of factors that push into that. But these reefs, they're really quite resilient, and they actually, they want to be here. Of course they do. So there's been quite a big push recently to start restoring oyster reefs. There was, $20 million given to the Nature Conservancy to restore oyster reefs around Australia, and it's working so well. Like in Port Stephens, they built an artificial reef, and 50 million oyster spat are now living and getting bigger and growing, and it's proving really effective. So here in Wodonga Inlet in Narooma, the Nature Conservancy, New South Wales DPI, and the Eurobodalla Shire Council are collaborating in the the Bateman's Marine Park for this living shoreline project. It's split into two parts. The first part, which we've just ticked off, is restoring 0.2 hectares of Sydney rock oyster intertidal habitat, which you can see there on your screen, and then also a deeper water 0.09 hectares of the Angazi reef, which is sort of subtidal. And then stage 2 is to do the rest of the reclaiming of habitat up to the walking path, as you can see there, and then that will be planted with a lot of different salt marsh and with terrestrial species in and amongst the mangroves that are already there. There's going to be boardwalks and jetties and educational signage. It's going to promote the area, but also, teach people about the functionality of the oyster reefs and living shorelines. And so, this is going to be teaching people about how they filter water, how they create food and habitat for lots of life, including the endangered black rock cod that we have down here. And then your mangroves and your salt marshes are providing shoreline protection, buffer zones. They're reducing the impacts of ocean acidification, and they're going to be designed in a way that with the rising sea level, they can slowly have that landward retreat. So it's going to be with all the pathways and that, it's going to be more accessible for everybody with less impact, but it's in such a public spot that so many people can see this conservation in action, and they can see the rapid and long-lasting sequestration all just happening right in front of them, which is amazing, right? So Nature Coast Marine Group and Ozfish are involved in the citizen science aspect of it. So it's going to be going out every 2 weeks for the first 2 months, and then every month thereafter, and doing surveys of these oyster reefs. And I mean, there's already been a lot of talk today about how important citizen science is. And for me, and I know this has been mentioned before, it's that sense of ownership and that stewardship and that connection to country that comes from the citizen science. Yeah, it's just is super key. So we're going to be out there sludging around and in the mud looking for oyster spat and crustaceans and mollusks and other critters that are making this place their home. So where are we now? We've just finished putting in the oyster reef. This is it in front of you with the endangered pied oyster catcher that is already loving it. And we had our first meet and greet session on the weekend, which went really well. We had lots of volunteers sign up and a lot of people just interested in finding out what was going on. So we're going to start developing all the training material and the survey stuff and getting those baselines as well before we actually start surveying in October, which is the start of the sort of recruitment period for all of these oysters. So I'm really excited about this project. I think it's great because it's right in everybody's faces and it's just doing a really good thing. So I'm really keen to be involved in it. And yeah, thank you guys for listening. If you have any queries or even if you just want to have a yarn about it, feel free to get in contact. And thank you.
Thanks, James. Can you just answer one question for me? What marine park zone is this really interesting partnership project in?
Marine park zone, I think it's a habitat protection zone. That whole area.
So that's where you get the odds fishing. Okay. Okay. Great. Thanks very much for that. We have to move on, but I really appreciate you giving your time.
No worries.
One last item, and that's a very important one. Janelle, are we good to go for that one, you know? Yeah. Excellent. So these are the youth, not that we all think we're youth to a certain degree, but we know how to get hold of them.
Yes.
I think they get even closer. That's even better. The people that are going to defend issues or otherwise are the mess we're leaving. So.
Pretty much.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, hi guys. So my name's Lisa and we're part of Coastal Youth. So for the better part of my life, I have lived on the south coast, near Batemans Bay, and I have seen firsthand the effects of decisions made by the government on my local environment. These decisions, unfortunately, have not prioritised my generation, and the future ones to come, but rather individual needs. As Australians, we must ensure that our beautiful oceans are protected and preserved. Sadly, the decision by the state government to cut the already inadequate sanctuary zones in the Batemans Bay Marine Park area is really the opposite of what we need to be seeing. As a young individual, the hardest thing to see is the science being ignored. We know climate change is one of the defining crises of our time and its devastating consequences being felt at an all-time high. We also know that Australia's biodiversity is facing continued decline, with another 34 species listed as threatened over the past 12 months. Continually, we see human-induced pollution deteriorating habitat health and growing the already large dead zones. These effects all pose significant risks to those that depend on the ocean and its resources. While all these problems may seem far-fetched and vast, we as humans are at the core of each and every one. It is up to us, all of us, to ensure that we listen to the science, that we can put a stop to the lasting consequences of the degradation of our oceans to ensure that we aren't the last generation to experience the Earth as we know it.
Protecting our oceans and conserving biodiversity is vital in building healthy ecosystems that are resilient against the impacts of climate change. Climate change causes rising water temperatures and sea levels, ocean acidification, and an increased frequency and intensity of weather events such as tropical cyclones, floods, and prolonged heat waves. We must protect our ocean from these impacts through the establishment of adequately sized sanctuary zones within our marine protected area systems to restore health to marine ecosystems and build resilience. For example, in areas where coral reefs exist, these sanctuary zones improve conditions for coral reef growth, allowing reefs to better recover from major bleaching events. Further, healthy reefs can protect coastlines from storms, waves, and flooding, which shows that sanctuary zones not only improve the resilience of marine ecosystems to the impacts of climate change, but also protect humans and infrastructure from these events. We need to protect these ecosystems now so that they can grow and build resilience. We know that as the impacts of climate change worsen in the future, marine ecosystems will face the impacts more significantly. Out of sight should not mean out of mind. If we protect our ocean now through the implementation of fully protected sanctuary zones, healthy ecosystems will follow, of which we will see the benefits in my generation's lifetime.
As we know, one of the major reasons why marine parks are burned is due to the small segment of community not understanding their scientific improvement benefits to ecosystem health and sustainable management of fish populations. If we allow for adequate protection via sanctuary zones within our marine protected areas, fish grow larger, there are more of them, and ecosystems are brought back to health. More and larger fish protected within sanctuary zones spill over into other areas of the marine park. These outcomes benefit everyone, recreational and commercial users alike. Without adequate protection from extractive activities, Fish populations are declining, fish sizes are shrinking, and habitat health is deteriorating. And this is not taking into account the devastating damage caused to so many marine species that are injured, maimed, or killed as a result of commercial and recreational fishing activities. Seabirds, turtles, rays, and non-target fish, such as sharks, are all prone to facial, hooking, and hook congestion injuries. As a young ocean lover, I want to enjoy the benefits of healthy marine environments that are thriving in life. I want to be able to enjoy seafood that is sustainably managed and caught without worrying about whether the fishery is in decline. Just as with protecting our land within terrestrial national parks, we need to protect important ocean habitats to ensure we have enough fish and healthy habitats to support them. There is a global movement to protect 30% of natural environments by 2030. At this time, when the term unprecedented has become all too familiar when talking about extreme weather events, we need to be bold, brave, and proactive in conserving and sustainably managing what is left of our wild places and the species that call them home. We need more sanctuary zones, not less. We support 30 by 30. Thank you.
That doesn't galvanise us to do a better job. I don't know what will. So obviously we're a little bit behind schedule. That's okay because it's now 2:20. I say we have a 5-minute shake and then come back, not just for a little talk fest. I'm going to call it, unless Janelle has a better idea, I'm going to call it the good idea session. So when you come back, so just be thinking of a few actions, the same with you girls, things we can actually do, positive things. You know, one thing I'd like to do is make habitat protection zones better. Maybe there's a way of linking with the allowance of fishing to make them better. Anything like that. So if you have good ideas, we'll come back and we might form small groups and then we'll just throw a few ideas at some potential actions so we don't. So we make sure this is not a talk fest, it's something with actions. Danielle, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Sounds great. And maybe while we're doing that, maybe you could talk to any questions or anything that come up with people on Zoom, maybe?
Sure. Are there hundreds or dozens or one?
There's, there might be important people out there who have questions.
Sure. Well, yeah, someone can read them to me.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a reader.
So maybe just say anyone on Zoom, send through questions and they can have a one-on-one chat with, say, you and John Turnbull if they've got any questions for the scientists.
Good.
I know there's a lot of
Did everyone hear that? I don't know if everyone can hear that.
Just repeat that.
Oh, yeah. So we're just having a very short break before what we might call good idea session for about half an hour. In the meanwhile, Danelle has suggested anyone online who would like a small session of chatting with, say, myself and John Turnbull or whoever else, or would just like to put some questions in the chat, we'll see if we can address them because we really do want some positive actions out of today. So thank you.
Okay. So Dave, the first question that we have for you, where is the chat on?
Chat.
More chat. Okay. Right. Okay. So let's have a look. Does the New South Wales Fishing Trust contribute towards conservation and sanctuary zones?
And John might have a comment on this as well. The New South Wales Fishing Trust, I'm not adept at what it currently does, but I know there's a rec fishing trust and there was a commercial fishing trust as well. Haven't heard as much about that one. The rec fishing trust disperses funding in various pots to various studies. We've applied mostly unsuccessfully in the past. It seems to focus on habitat restoration, but maybe I'm wrong again. So it's certainly a place for funding for good environmental work. I don't think there's anything in their charter if someone said I want to look at the effects of sanctuary zones, but I also don't know anyone who's got funded for that, so I'm not sure if that's just a coincidence or otherwise. John, do you have any experience?
Yeah, look, I have a little bit of experience in this space too, but my own personal experience is there's a focus of conservation typically around providing habitat for fishing important species, so where hatcheries and places, nursery areas, seagrass and so on. So the conservation tends to focus on the conservation actions that would benefit the fish species that the fishers care about. And that of course is a narrow slice of overall conservation, but that's just my personal experience. So it may be much broader than that.
Just I guess carrying on, another source of funding or engagement is the FRDC, the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, which is a co-funded, I think, or co-managed organisation between the federal government and commercial fishery group. Once again, significant funding can be achieved, but they have specific guidelines and specific topics each year. And I must admit, I haven't seen too many concerning marine parks.
I might just say one other thing, and that is, it's all well and good to turn to a group like fishing groups to support conservation, but ultimately they're not responsible for the biodiversity and conservation of the marine estate. That's the responsibility of the respective department. So I would turn my attention more to why aren't we seeing adequate funding to see marine protected areas properly conserved, properly managed, properly monitored, and funds being made available through those agencies for conservation actions.
Right, and we wouldn't be relying on Reef Life Survey, although of course there's an excellent data underwater video program through New South Wales Marine Parks, which is great as well. But yeah, we need a little more embedded funding for that probably.
Fantastic. And I'm just trying to get to the. Is there anyone in this room who has a specific question? Maybe it'd be great. To hear from someone who wants to talk about maybe one of the ocean youth advocates who want to come up and talk about the discussion around what we just had, what sort of actions youth can take, and also the older generation can take to make sure you have a greater voice in this marine parks and marine sanctuary space. Well, we all kind of just had a discussion at the room, which I think permits you guys online to really hear. But what we were saying basically is there's so many eager young people like ourselves who are really just ready to get involved and ready to be part of these big organisations. But the problem is we're finding like there's no kind of bridge between what a lot of the organisations are doing and then young people's voices. So what we were just talking about is, I suppose, how we can bridge that gap and how we can, as young people, engage with politicians and with advocates, and how we can do that in a way that I suppose everyone kind of gets to go at sharing their opinion.
Yeah, I think we're just kind of saying, like, well, I was saying I learned so much today and was like mind blown by how interested I was in everything. And I just think we need more opportunities like this to learn like real world applications of what we learn in school and like go beyond and be able to actually specialize in areas we're interested in. So I really think like reaching out to young people and like getting them involved in like issues that we're interested about and actually learning like that high level, like what people are actually doing about it is like so beneficial for everyone.
And like before today, like I didn't even like really know what marine park like actually fully did. So like I think this was like a really good like learning experience as well.
So I suppose any of you guys online or here want to like get more young people involved. Like I know Claudette, I don't know if you guys have heard me, but like we're super happy to I suppose just like hear what you have to say, but then also take that and talk to our peers at school or our peers in other groups that we're in, and really get them on board, because we're kind of like here, like we can be your bridge, like. We're ready to get engaged kind of in all spaces. So, yeah, if you guys want more young people, yeah. I can see why you don't like reading computer.
Make a little comment on that. So, just to comment on what you guys have been saying. I've been involved in National Parks Association, Nature Conservation Council and Australian Marine Science Association. And I would say it sounds like on the back, all of those organisations would love and welcome your involvement. So I think maybe it's a two-way thing. One is explore what you could become a member, for example. But I actually would like to turn the challenge the other way and say, to those organisations, let's talk about actively creating a youth contact channel or a way that makes it really clear to your generation that you're really welcome, you've got a contribution to make. I think we should turn the challenge to the organisations themselves. And I'm daydreaming and saying to well, could there be a youth communication or membership category for a Marine Science Association? We've never probably even thought of that, but I'll be talking about it in our next committee meeting based on today. So let's throw the challenge to those organisations to create a way of connecting to youth and make it welcoming and really obvious that this is something that you can do.
And of course, a lot of these organisations like AMCS, CRS, or all the ones we belong to, are very student focused. My students back there are members, and a lot of, if there's a conference, there's much cheaper rates for students. If there's student dues and things like that, a lot of the funding we bring in. So, it just has to move to not just the undergraduate research students, beyond that. I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
Just on that, I'd encourage, I support these guys. I'm part of this conservation group, Nature Coast Marine group, very top heavy with elder people. And we do need to bridge that gap. And I would say that, from my experience, with anything done where there is elders and children and all generations coming together, that's where the real magic happens. We have to paddle out, in the room, and you'll see it. You got little toddlers on a paddle out board, getting paddled out there by their granddad. It brings a kiddie, right? It's magic. So look for that. So have your time with your groups yourselves, but look to your elders for when those times where you get a little bit lost, perhaps, and it's just like, well, we've got all this energy, we don't know what to do with it. Seek your elders. They will give you advice. They will guide you to best use your great, beautiful energy.
Fantastic. And to add to that, I know that AMCS and MPA are also, always keen to engage young people. And if it takes things like this, like a forum where we can connect with young people, obviously it's our goal to do something bigger and better next time. Maybe we just need to make sure that there's more younger people present and more people from the conservation community. So you've got a wider range of people to connect with, and obviously it's great, when you have political folk and government representatives that can be here too, so you can feel that your voice is being listened to. So we really appreciate your feedback. I also have two more questions that have been answered. So there were two questions earlier from Merrin and Dylan, which they wanted to ask Mike Sutton about. So I'll just find out what those questions were. Hold on. 2 seconds. So Merrin wrote in the chat earlier, "Hi Mike, I'm reading that no-take zones tend to be less than 10k square meters in California. I'm wondering how small do your no-take sanctuaries get? In Sydney's east, we are very built up and this will be an issue for us. Thanks." Mike wrote back in response. I asked him via email. It's true that some MPAs in California are quite small. For example, in Carmel Bay, near where I live, we created the Carmel Pinnacles State Marine Reserve to protect 2 pinnacles that are favourite scuba diving sites. That small reserve is nested within the larger state marine conservation area where some fishing is allowed. We designed California's MPA network to be large enough to conserve the places and species in the coastal ocean. The size of these areas were dictated largely by biology and distribution of the species involved. There was no minimum or maximum size determined beforehand. I don't know if one of our scientists here have a comment around the size of sanctuary zones that you'd like to add before we get to the next question.
Yeah, I'll comment quickly. We did a study on this. We looked at small MPAs and whether or not they could be effective. It's a pretty sensible result. result that came out of that. You can have very small MPAs. Chemistry Bay works really well, but it has a commensurately small scale impact. So it has better fish populations within that small area, but it's not enough to protect the ecosystem or the northern beaches or fish that swim large ranges. So you do get an uplift, but your uplift is constrained by the size you choose. There's no doubt that bigger is better because that then captures more species ranges. But if you have a goal, which is, I want to protect just one pinnacle or just one bay, you can have a small bay and it will work. It comes down to your goals. But if your goals are broad, which they are in New South Wales, it's about ecosystem-wide and bioregion-wide diversity, then you need the big-scale parks to meet that.
I'll just make a comment. We often should look at terrestrial science and we often forget what happened in the past. In 1960, Robert McCarthy, the very famous ecologist I'm sure you've all heard of, came up with the term sloths, single large or several small, and Daniel Simberloff, to represent there's choices, there's trade-offs to be made. We can't completely follow terrestrial work because we have two big differences. One is we have adults with very small range for a lot of these reef species, fish at least, and we also have this thing called connectivity, which doesn't happen as much on land. So the East Australian current is driving larvae down the coast and they're moving quite large, not the big guys, the larvae. And so the connectivity of our parks is very, very important for maintaining biodiversity. Where's Sydney Marine Park? I don't know. So that's why it's so important. If this was on land, it wouldn't be as vital. Because we're in the sea, we've got those other aspects. But otherwise, a lot of the theory has been developed 50 years ago on land with just a few modifications. We think we're starting again, but we're not.
And just on the youth point, someone just wrote, I would love to see more of an intersection between culture and environmentalism to further the marine conservation movement. Emotional connections build public support. And she's saying that she's at www.blueworld.net.au if anyone wants to reach out to her. So she said, thanks to the youth for reaching that out. Gary, did you want to add something?
Yes. No, I wanted to actually ask some question of David and John.
Yeah.
In the terrestrial space, it's actually really easy talking about protected areas. For the most part, we just get to talk about national parks and nature reserves and a few other transitory sort of categories. Today, we've spoken about marine estate, marine parks, marine protected areas, aquatic reserves, and I think there was even a whisper in the title, protected areas earlier. In terms of framing our ask for the coming government, whether it's the same flavour as the current one or it's a different one, what do you see as the simplest way of actually presenting what it is we're after? And in your view, what is it we should be after? What's the number and what's the thing that we're actually asking for?
Just to recap the question, that was from the CEO of the National Parks Association, and he's asking Professor David Booth or Dr. John Turnbull, what should the policy or election ask be, I guess, from the conservation community to our election, to our elected officials or the candidates in the upcoming election.
Yeah, so imagine if you did have a zoning system in terrestrial parks. Well, you can take your bag, a little bit of koalas over here, it's a habitat protection zone. It wouldn't rub it, but for various reasons, if you're stream reasonableness, it's come through. As I've already stated, I think the habitat protection zone is a much larger proportion, unless I'm wrong, than the sanctuary zone in marine parks. I suppose one option would be to somehow improve that to get better outcomes than the zero or near zero outcomes it's giving at the moment. The other outcome, of course, is to increase sanctuary zones. But again, there's going to have to be political will. This is going to take decades to show the difference. I mean, solitaries, it took a decade or so for many of these long-lived fish species, for instance, to really, really recover. So that's a couple of political cycles. So it is a difficult question. John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, look, I come back to my talk where the real ecological performance comes from sanctuary zones. So to me, that's as a scientist, as an ecologist, that's the focus. We should be talking about the implementation, management, and proper monitoring of sanctuary zones. And the percentages that we're talking about should be sanctuary zones. Any other zone, habitat protection or whatever, may have benefits. It may be, okay, let's ban commercial fishing so the recreational fishers catch more fish. Great, but don't think it has a conservation benefit. It has a social benefit. So I think we need to get away from this idea that non-sanctuary marine park areas are conservationally valuable. Generally, they're not, with some very small exceptions. You know, you might preserve an area where you get spawning activity once a year. Okay, that might be partially protected. But with those very few exceptions, generally speaking, what matters to the marine community is full protection. The marine underwater community is full protection. Now, whatever we call that, historically it's been sanctuary, but there are other jurisdictions where they call them marine national parks. I think even Victoria might use that phrase. So I think we should be focusing on marine national park areas. And if the powers that be want to have other areas with lesser protection, go for it. But let's not consume valuable marine conservation area by using those downgraded percentages. Another way of thinking of it is every square kilometre that you put in which is partially protected is a square kilometre that is not properly protected, but is actually now occupying space in the mindset of people thinking, what protection do we have? So it actually is a blocking strategy in a way. Those partially protected areas effectively stop sanctuary zone being put in those places because they look like they're doing something. So I agree with Dave. I actually see partially protected areas as actually more problematic than beneficial. And I would rather see either none of them or let's call them what they are, which is either a buffer zone or a social, fishing management zone or whatever it is, but they're not conservation areas, certainly in terms of the research that I've done.
Quick question that we'll go to Peter. I just wanted to ask, well, do you think, something to add to that, do we need to be looking at, say, town plan for our whole ocean section of our coastline, work out what should be zoned as well?
I was going to say, we need some consistency around Australian naming. In a way, you'd like to call them no-take areas, although I had a fisher once say to me, that's fine, I like that, I'll put the fish back, that's no-take. So don't use that term. Think of a better one.
In terms of my question, do you think we need to be just like we would for a town, look at town plan for the entire coastline to work out what's general use?
But that was the idea of me, exactly right, John, the Marine Estate Management Authority. And so they are tasked with the whole marine estate. And sad, I think marine parks have got a bit of a sideline. Would I be foolish in saying that at the moment? They've already about Tara, the threats and risk assessment, which is a wonderfully useful document, the original one, which detailed all the potential threats. But what they then did is they had a consultant come in and rank the threats. So they conveniently broke up, for instance, fishing into 6 different categories. So none of those categories was number one. I think four-wheel drives on the beach actually were greater than some of them by that estimate, which is ridiculous. So the idea then was to manage the threats, not necessarily with marine parks. So which sounded a reasonable idea, but of course it took away the idea of these protected areas that were decent size.
Yeah, just to pick up that idea, it is the case that as part of initially laying out the designs for a marine protected area, we do that sort of analysis, habitats and where they are, where we think them to be, because often there are proxies used. That is done. But then unfortunately, the maps of where those habitats are across the whole marine estate, they don't then become the driving force for protection. If you did use them and say, right, here's where the kelp is, and here's where the soft sediment is, and here's where the sponge gardens are, and then you went on to say, now we're going to protect 30% of each one, then you have to keep going. So we start off with the right idea in doing the mapping, but then we turn our attention to social values driving the process, and so the mapping becomes almost forgotten in that process, and then we end up with a marine park that doesn't work. So the habitat mapping approach is intended and does get done. But the trouble is it doesn't drive the outcome like I believe it should.
So I just want to get back to Gary's question a little bit. When he's talking about certain policy asks, would it be correct in any way to say maybe that our ask for this, whatever the next government is, that we would like 30 by 30? Is that a distinct ask?
Well, I believe the Australian government has committed to that. So I think that should be our ask, but it should be a real 30 by 2030, not a pretend 30 by 2030. So if you look at the Sydney Marine Park proposal, I don't know what percentage of the bioregion it was, let's say it was 30%. They would have said, great, we've done 30% of the Hawkesbury bioregion, but only 2% of that is sanctuary. We need to be saying in return, well, no, you don't score that at 30, you score that at 2.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to be very clear. What we're talking about is ecologically effective protection rather than just lines on maps, which you can pretty well do whatever you like. And to illustrate the point, there is a protection area, an aquatic reserve called Boat Harbour, we've heard it mentioned. You can take pretty much anything you like out of Boat Harbour. You can fish for finfish, you can collect anything you like. The one thing you're actually not allowed to collect, which is maybe the one thing that out of everything that's protected, the one thing you're not allowed to do is take urchins. Why? Well, you can imagine the consultation process. We're going to make this an aquatic reserve, but we're going to consult the community. We're going to stop you from taking this. I know we like to take that. Oh, okay. We'll stop you from taking this. Oh, we like to take that. Well, how about we stop you from taking urchins? Yeah, okay, you can have that. So we end up with an aquatic reserve where really the only thing that's banned is something that you actually might want to do, which is to remove some urchins. That's the trouble with taking a stakeholder-driven design approach. I'm not saying don't take a stakeholder-driven overall approach, but the design of the zonings has to be targeted at ecological effectiveness.
Did you want to add something?
Not really, but I was partly involved in the Great Barrier Marine Park zoning in 2005. And you mentioned 30%, it was 5% before that. I mean, my colleagues overseas could not believe it wasn't 100%. Isn't it a marine national park? 5%. We brought it up to 33%. But we did another thing too. We actually made it a sensible 33. So in sort of little bits, we understood a lot of these animals would connect from the coast to the outer edge. So we actually had, you'll notice if you look at the map, strips like that. So it wasn't just we've got to get to 20 or 30%. It was what 30% was, and that it did include information on whale passages and all those mobile creatures too. So it's not as easy as just picking any 30%, which is often what happens. I was in the Great Lakes Committee, and yes, it was steered away from what ecological was the right thing to do, what avoided certain use zones. So that's the other, as you said, stakeholders can derail a good park.
Dylan also had another question for Mike earlier, which he also responded by email to me. So did Mike have a percentage target to guide his negotiations? Mike's response is we do not set any percentage targets for the regional stakeholder groups tasked with designing the MPA network. Rather, the science advisory committees for each region establish representative targets for protection of each underwater habitat, e.g. sandy, rocky reef, kelp forest. If the stakeholder groups came up with a proposal that did not contain sufficient protection for a particular habitat, the group was then sent back to the drawing board, which is interesting. The science advisory group really did have veto power to prevent political compromises from spoiling the effectiveness of this MPA network. So I guess considering the California example, then the question follows, what do you think about not having a target in mind to achieve those scientific goals?
Look, I would say that if we had the level of power and monetary funding that they had in California, we could afford to say, let's just let the scientists make sure the marine park will work. And if we could do that, then we wouldn't need the 30%, because the scientists will say, you only want to protect 5% of sponge gardens. Well, that's not enough to have enough of the community to then have spawning activity in place and so on. So you don't need the 30% if you've got the scientific oversight. The 30% is really actually just a way of overcoming the fact that we don't have the level of scientific control that we really should have. But it also is a summary of the literature, because many studies have looked at what does 10% do, what does 20% do. And so on average, it's a good rule of thumb, but it's better if you can be much more precise and precise instruments that the scientists will use if they have that choice.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, the research concerns spill over. I mean, it's been done for a couple of species. It's complicated genetics to work out if a baby fish or whatever is produced in the park, how many then make it outside and vice versa. You know, that would require the sum total of hundreds and thousands of species in their biological information to get it spot on, but I think generally accepted that 30% is a good bottom figure.
Question. Yeah. So someone has put actually not quite sure HPS habitat. Oh yeah, oh yes, habitat. Yes, okay, habitat protection zones and general use zones also take up precious time resources of MP managers. We need to be aiming at next public consultation on draft rules of management plans, equal zones. Trade-off habitat protection zones into sanctuary zones and to general use zones, question mark. So hopefully you can interpret that.
Well, there's not much else to say apart from what John himself has been saying, is that the other zones aren't of much value, at least from the biological conservation point of view, which is the main goal in the Act, correct? The social and economic subsidiary and important things that will benefit from conservation. So unless you could argue that those, say, habitat protection zones had educational value of some sort that enhanced the effectiveness of the sanctuary, I don't think I think you're right, they are taking away valuable resources.
Yeah. Some of the points we make in the paper that I referenced on partially protected areas is there's an opportunity cost to these partially protected areas. If you think of yourself as having a fixed amount of resource, okay, I've got a fixed amount of spend to make this marine park, or I have a fixed amount of area that I can afford to allocate to it. Every dollar that you spend on a partially protected area, or every square kilometre that you put in a partially protected area, is a dollar that's not spent and not allocated to sanctuary zones. So therefore they actually have a cost. And we've just heard here from this other person, there is also a cost to the marine park manager's time. So look, I think this idea of reversing the trend of converting our parks to have an oversupply of partial protection and an undersupply of sanctuary zone, we should be arguing to reallocate that. We actually should have a dominance of sanctuary zones and only use habitat protection or partial protection as the exception rather than the rule. Currently, 80% of our marine parks are partial protection. So I'd like to see it go the other way. I'd like it to be 80% sanctuary and 20% partial. And that partial should be targeted. Let's put a bit of partial protection around the edge of each sanctuary zone to provide buffer. That would be a really good idea and a really good way of consuming conservation resources. Let's use partial protection in very targeted ways to protect that seagrass area to stop anchoring. But let's not make it the rule, let's make it the exception. The rule should be sanctuary.
Couldn't agree more. Any more cues up there? I don't know. That's probably about enough. Anything else? Having some sort of cluster down there.
We all actually have to go, and
I think it's someone's had more to say. All right, I think it's probably timely to finish up our proceedings now, but let's just hope that we can use this as a springboard to some action. The engaging the youth, great action. the push for more sanctuaries, of course, with science involved, and have a scientist in your group, you know, and when there are positions on things like the MEMA scientific committee, usually organisations like you guys will have an input, so we don't see, shall I call, land scientists on board these. You'll have some that have a bit of feist and are willing to stand up. So I won't say any more about that. So think of some actions. If you think of anything else clever in the Zoom or here, send it to Danelle. I guess that'd be the best thing. And I'd like to see a collation of this sometime and an action for next time.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll just put my email address in it.
Okay, and yeah, obviously thanks to you guys, and the food was fantastic. Which is a big thing for me. I see nice quality stuff. Great to see everyone together. Thanks to our students and John and all those people who come today. And let's see more like these. And we're going to be strong. I mean, if we too often we'll win back. You know, I don't know what to do next in terms of that. You guys are the experts with action, but maybe it's the time has changed, changes of government and that sort of thing. Maybe we can get some good outcomes. So, thanks everyone. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and thank you on behalf of all the environmental NGOs here today. So, thank you.